Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 16 of the hearings here in Epping. It's 10 o'clock, and so today's hearing is now open. Can everybody hear me at the back? Thank you. I'm Louise Phillips, the inspector appointed to examine the Epping Forest District Local Plan, and the programme officer is Louise St John Howe. Please could anyone with a mobile phone turn it off or switch it to silent now, and could I ask the council once again to remind us of the fire procedure? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. There is no planned fire drill today, so if the fire alarm sounds, we do need to exit. The exit is the route that you took to come into the building and down the stairs and assemble on the green behind the buildings here. If for any reason that route is blocked, we can exit the alternative route, which is behind me through the doors and down the stairs and through the car park. The toilets are located on the stairwells as you came in.
Thank you. So following that, the now familiar reminder about filming. So this meeting is being broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of subsequent repeated viewing, with copies of the recording being made available upon request. So by being present at this meeting, the recording cameras are likely to capture your image and you will become part of the broadcast. So you should be aware that this could infringe your human and data protection rights, and if you have any concerns, please speak to the webcasting officer to my left. And please could I remind you once again to activate your microphones when speaking. If you wish to speak on a particular topic, if you could alert me as soon as possible, please, by turning your board on its side so that we know how many people wish to speak in relation to each issue under discussion. Unless there are any immediate questions, if I could ask everybody around the table to introduce themselves, please. If you say who you're representing, which site if relevant, and your interest in this morning's session, which is on infrastructure and delivery. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Madam. My name is Mark Beard, Counsel for Epping Forest District Council. To my right sits Mr. David Coleman, and to his right, Ms. Alison Blom-Cooper, both from the Council. Today we're supported by Mr. Simon Drummond-Hay, who sits to the right of Ms. Blom-Cooper, but also by Mr. Dan Evans, and also by Ms. Amanda Harris, who's the Council's Strategic Infrastructure and Planning Obligations Officer. I should have said that Mr. Dan Evans is from Arup.
Thank you.
Good morning, Inspector. John Goodall of DLP on behalf of Peer Group for the Ongar Park Estate, land at North Weald Bassett.
Thank you.
Morning, Ma'am. Contrary to your list, my name is not Sam Hollingworth, it's Andy Butcher. I'm here for Countryside Properties, representing North Weald Bassett Strategic Master Plan area.
Thank you.
Morning, Ma'am. Rob Jameson, Nat Waters, Jameson Hill, representing North Weald Bassett Parish Council. The Council's interest this morning is, as you know, it has not objected to the quantum of development proposed in the plan, but has great concerns to ensure that the necessary infrastructure is both identified and then there are reasonable prospects of it being delivered in a timely fashion.
My name's Joe Ellis. I work for RPS. We're acting on behalf of Miller Homes for the East Harlow development.
Thank you.
David Keane of David Lock Associates on behalf of the Fairfield Partnership in respect of allocation EPP R2, land south of Epping.
Thank you.
Paul Belton, Carter Jonas on behalf of Pigeon Investment Management, who have a land interest to the east of Epping.
Thank you.
My name is Nick Taylor from the Harlow Alliance Party, and we share the same concerns as the gentleman from North Weald.
Thank you.
Catherine Ullman from Lawson Planning, speaking on behalf of Princess Alexandra Hospital. The hospital has a preferred option to relocate to a site north of Junction 7A in the East Harlow allocation, and the hospital is a key item of infrastructure and is also dependent upon infrastructure to a degree to ensure it's successful in its relocation.
Thank you.
Henry Stamp, individual resident of Epping with an interest obviously in infrastructure, transport and planning in Epping and around.
Mary Dad, Ongar Neighbourhood Plan Community Group, and also representing Ongar Town Council, and in particular the general issues D1 and D4.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning, I'm Mike Newton from Boyer Planning, representing CEG and Hallam Land Management in connection with Latin Priory.
Thank you.
Laura Taylor-Green, Essex County Council Public Health.
Thank you.
Julia Riddle, Castle Planning, on behalf of Loughton Town Council.
John Manning, I'm a chartered civil engineer, a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. I've lived in Loughton, Bobbingworth, Ongar, and now live in Epping for approximately 50 years when I've not been tearing around the world in connection with work, and I appear here as a local resident interested in the plan.
Thank you very much.
Ma'am, may I?
Sorry, I missed some people. Thank you.
Not exactly, because I'm assisting Julia Riddle for the Town Council, but I should, Chris Pond, should make it known that I'm also with a washing brief for the Loughton Residents Association this morning.
Thank you.
And good morning, Rich Cook, Planning, Essex County Council.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we'll turn to the agenda. I think there's probably quite a lot to discuss this morning. I know there's a little bit of overlap with this afternoon, and indeed with the participants here. So I'll try to avoid any duplication, but I've put some general issues at the top of the agenda which don't relate to the issues specifically that I asked on my matters, issues and questions, because they seem to sort of be the overarching things that people remain concerned about, with perhaps the more policy-specific things being to do with wording. So I thought it might be helpful to have this more general discussion of the substantive issues, if you like, up front. I intend to deal with, as I've got two main bullet points, to deal with that in two parts, but to deal with each one altogether in the way that we have done in some previous sessions, by asking the council to cover all of the sort of subheadings on the agenda and then go around the table, as far as possible, asking everybody to have one go, make all the points that you're concerned about, and then come back to the council for a response, because I don't think we're going to have time this morning for sort of lots of toing and froing between the parties. So if there is time, then I'll obviously allow that, but there's quite a lot to cover, and it's important that I get through it all. So that's how I intend to proceed to start with. Perhaps as well, I think it might be helpful in point one if I say something about my current thoughts about how to deal with perhaps the recent work in relation to the Garden Town, so that anybody who feels strongly contrary to what I suggest can say that, rather than listen to lots of discussion and then set out my stall. Now, my understanding is that the Garden Town work came out reasonably late in the day. There wasn't a great opportunity for people to comment on that, even within the statements for that session. With that said, you've now had quite a long time to look at it, and I think it's reasonable for you to raise any sort of key points that you have at this session in order that the council can respond to those. I also understand, though, that my colleague who's examining the Harlow plan is likely to allow some time for written comment on those documents, and so that is something that I'm giving consideration to, with a limited audience, to be fair, to those who've submitted statements perhaps in relation to these two sessions, today's sessions, and to the Garden Town Matter 8 session. And if I were to do that, there'd be a deadline of the Thursday following the last hearing, so I think around the 13th of June. All of this can be, so that I would have all of the information that I would need within that week, so as not to cause any delay. Now, that's my initial thoughts, thinking, because I think lots of people around the table are likely to tell me that they feel an opportunity for further written comment is required. But with that said, you have now had quite a long time to look at the documents, and so I don't want it to cause an unnecessary delay to the examination. So that's my initial thoughts. If the council strongly disagrees, then tell me so, and if other people feel strongly, then under this first bullet point, then you can tell me so. It would be useful as well if you could tell me why you feel that more time is required, if indeed you do. Anyway, so that said, hopefully that might avoid some examination time being dealt with. So let's start on the first bullet point. So the role and status of the IDP, the Infrastructure Delivery Plan, and viability studies as living documents. Now, I'll just read out the sorts of things that I want to hear about, and then we'll proceed in the way that I've outlined. So, firstly, can developers, or is the council expecting developers to be committed to the precise items of infrastructure listed in the IDP, or to the apportionment currently proposed where this is available? So the Garden Town document sets out the apportionment in much more detail than the other documents. If not, then if they can't be committed to that, is the role of the IDP and the need for flexibility appropriately reflected in the plan at the moment? Then the point in bold is essentially what I've just set out. How do we deal with the amendments or updates to the IDP, such as the recent work for the Garden Towns? Now, obviously, specific comments are going to be made on the Garden Towns, but again, my understanding is that the IDP as living document is likely to be updated. Can we expect consultation to take place on that all the time? And if not, then how do we rely upon infrastructure, if you like, that's outside of the plan? Should the IDP be referenced in the policy wording? It is at the moment, and does and should the plan itself identify the essential infrastructure associated with specific developments? Now, one other thing just to point out, I've obviously noted from the statements, and this was something I was going to raise under issue 1, but in terms of the role of the IDP, I think representatives were generally seemed fairly content and thought that the policy was pretty clear about the need for developers to refer to the site-specific requirements in Appendix 6 of the plan and to the IDP to determine what infrastructure requirements were necessary. So there didn't seem to be a fundamental objection to that process. It was more about how it was actually conveyed and achieved in the plan and the certainty and the extent to which they'd be tied to it. So that's my understanding of what people are thinking. Anyway, I'll be quiet now, and we'll hear from the council and then go around the table. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam. Can I just start by saying that the council would endorse the approach to inviting further written comments by the 13th of June, or approximately by that date, as you've set out. I think that would be a fair approach to considering the Garden Town documentation has come forward. I will address the points on your agenda, the various points you've outlined under the first main bullet point. So bear with me, because hopefully the answer will give some clarification as well to yourselves and other participants on the council's intention. In terms of can developers be committed to the precise items listed or the apportionment currently proposed, and is the role of the IDP appropriately conveyed in the plan? The first thing to say is no, developers cannot be committed to the precise items listed. The IDP is a live document, and by its very nature provides a snapshot in time. As different infrastructure providers respond to various challenges and changing circumstances, the information they provide will naturally change. The IDP, when it's published or reviewed, is based upon the best available information at that time. As I will explain, there are a number of areas of work which are ongoing by the council and by its delivery partners, which will further inform infrastructure requirements, and therefore flexibility will be required regarding the approach to the delivery of the items listed and apportionment arrangements where those are already set out. Hopefully everyone's got a copy of the revised version of Policy D1, which is entitled Delivery of Infrastructure. Seems that everyone has. Within that, the council is proposing an amendment to Policy D1 on the third page of the handout to insert a new paragraph B within Policy D1, and that conveys the role more clearly of the infrastructure delivery plan and its need for flexibility. So appreciating that people have probably only just received that. The wording is that development proposals must contribute proportionately towards the delivery of those infrastructure items set out in the infrastructure delivery plan, unless subsequent iterations of the IDP or discussions with providers determine that these requirements have changed. Planning obligations will only be sought where they meet the relevant tests set out in national planning policy. In relation to the further work from the Garden Town that's been provided, that's been published, and also I'll cover the other work that's also ongoing for the rest of the district. As you will appreciate, the local plan is complex and comprehensive, incorporating over 80 site allocations. Alongside the publication and submission of the plan, the Council, together with partner organisations, providers and stakeholders, has continued to undertake further collaborative work in order to define and clarify infrastructure requirements associated with planned growth and to provide greater clarity to applicants. Inevitably, this means that the production of the IDP does not and should not stop at the Regulation 19 stage of the local plan. Not least because, in some instances, it can be difficult for the Council to obtain details of infrastructure requirements from infrastructure providers until those providers have the certainty of a published Regulation 19 plan to consider. Since the publication of the draft IDP report in September 2016, and then what I'll refer to as the primary IDP report in December 2017, as you know, that's EB 1101 A and B, the Council has produced and published a number of additional documents. Just briefly summarise those, if I may. The first one was an IDP topic paper, and that's EB 1101C. That was published in October 2018 and provides a high-level framework for apportionment and pooling arrangements to be taken forward for key infrastructure. The paper provides more information on external funding sources outlined in the IDP, including the work that's currently ongoing to progress and secure funding, and also highlights any risks of funding not being in place and potential contingency measures for that. It also considers the potential role of the Community Infrastructure Levy should the Council decide to pursue its introduction. Secondly, an addendum to the IDP topic paper was published in April 2019. That is EB 1101E. And that document provides further clarification in relation to the apportionment of developer contributions associated with education and highways mitigation projects for sites across the district. Lastly, the Council is currently producing a further addendum to the topic paper relating to the provision of sports facilities. That follows the statement of common ground with Sport England, and that will be made available as soon as the work is complete. In terms of sustainable transportation work, we'll obviously be covering this during the day several times, but I'll just set out in summary what's happening at the moment. So the Council published the Epping Forest Cycling Action Plan in March of 2018. That's EB 504. A sustainable transport strategy is now also under production, which will provide further details of planned future improvements to bus services and other means of sustainable travel, helping to clarify how developer contributions will facilitate improvements and how these will contribute towards modal shift across the district. Following completion of the further work still underway, still being undertaken, the Council intends to produce a further updated viability assessment, which will take into account the information that will be available and provide up-to-date evidence to inform development, management and planning decisions. We spoke about that at an earlier session. It's not intended that work would be brought before the examination. No timescale is yet set for the work to be concluded. That work will build upon and supplement the existing viability study, which underpins the soundness of the local plan, and that's EB 301. It's not intended to duplicate or overlap with the Garden Town viability study. This will be covering the areas of the district outside of the Garden Town. When undertaking that further work, the Council will consult and engage with stakeholders and ensure that there are opportunities for comments to be made by interested parties in accordance with the PPG and best practice. And that is very much with a view to providing up-to-date evidence when taking planning decisions and relating those to paragraph 57 of the new MPPF 2019. In terms of the Garden Town, the Council has published the following further documents, as you're aware, and they were published on 18th of April of this year. The first one is a Harlow and Gilston Garden Town how-to guide for planning obligations, land value capture and development viability. That's ED 33. The second one is the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town Infrastructure Delivery Plan. It's ED 34. The third one is the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town Strategic Viability Assessment, ED 35. Through the work of the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, additional further work is being undertaken to develop detailed plans for the promotion of sustainable transport provision, which will supplement existing studies. A local cycling, walking and infrastructure plan is being commissioned to support modal shift away from private car use. And that's being commissioned by the Garden Town partner authorities. That will supplement the draft transport strategy of the Garden Town, which is EB 1408, and the existing work setting out plans for the sustainable transport corridors, which is EB 1407. Council also produced a homework note for the examination. That was homework note 12, which is ED 56. That was produced on the 10th of May, and that clarifies the intended approach to the application of paragraph 57 of the MPPF 2019. It also provides further context in relation to the role and status of the further work undertaken by the Council, and sets out details of the consultation and engagement that's informed the Garden Town work. It also provides a number of proposed amendments to policies H2 and to D1, and those amendments to D1 are reflected on the handout. In conclusion, the Council considers that the further work which has been undertaken and continues to be undertaken in relation to infrastructure and viability will be beneficial and helpful in providing greater clarity to applicants and stakeholders in terms of the future requirements that are set out in the primary IDP, and also the requirements that are set out in the local plan policies themselves. The further work represents the iterative and ongoing nature of infrastructure planning, and in our view far exceeds the basic requirements within national planning policy and guidance in terms of assessing the soundness of the plan. And as I've mentioned, the Council is ensuring and will ensure that further work is informed by appropriate engagement and consultation. But we believe that the policies in the local plan already provide sufficient flexibility to enable applicants and decision makers to reflect and respond to changing circumstances, including changing viability considerations. And following the examination hearings, there will be a consultation on proposed modifications, but as we've discussed, we would endorse the approach that you've set out in terms of further comments being submitted on the Garden Town work. Just very briefly, in terms of your last couple of bullet points, should the IDP be referenced in the policy wording? Yes, we believe that the IDP is appropriately referenced within policy D1 as it's now proposed to be amended. It's also referenced within the places policies and within the local plan generally. We think those references are appropriate and will ensure that the policies in the plan remain effective by providing clarity of key infrastructure requirements, whilst also ensuring that applicants are required to consult the latest iteration of the IDP when preparing proposals. This reflects the need to ensure that policies incorporate flexibility and are not overly prescriptive. In terms of are the essential infrastructure requirements identified, we think that the existing references to requirements in policy are appropriate and provide the sufficient flexibility whilst ensuring the timely delivery of infrastructure. Applicants will be required to consult both the local plan policies, in particular the place-specific policies in Chapter 5, and also the requirements in Appendix 6, which set out the key infrastructure requirements, but also to consult the IDP to establish which items of infrastructure they are likely to need to provide or contribute towards. Site-specific requirements will then be established through discussion at pre-application stage with the Council, And where appropriate, infrastructure providers will be involved in those discussions. It's also worth noting that the production of concept frameworks and strategic master plans for relevant sites will help to refine those requirements further for those relevant areas. Council considers that D1 already makes that flexibility sufficiently clear. There was another amendment which hasn't been picked up, which is relatively minor but important. On policy D1, the new paragraph B that's been inserted should meet the relevant tests set out in National Planning Policy and the SIL Regulations 2010. So just the additional words, and the SIL Regulations 2010. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I can take comments around the table now on those those general overarching issues. I obviously am aware that there's changes proposed to Part E of the policy around the sort of exceptions, if you like, to having to comply with the plan and when there might be site-specific viability. I think perhaps if we could discuss those under issue 1 rather than now, and we've heard about the amendment proposed to Part B now, so if we can cover that now but save any discussion on the sort of exceptions, if you like, until issue 1, that would be helpful. Thank you. So remember what I said before, if we can try to do it with one go each, please. So if you want to speak on this point, if you can put up your boards as soon as possible so I know how many people there are, that's really helpful. Thank you. Mr. Jameson.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm taking it from what you've said. First of all, we're dealing with all your sub-questions under the general issue now, and we're to have one bite at the cherry, say what we want, and then we're done.
Yes.
I'll do that as quickly as I can.
Thank you.
The first sub-point, can developers be committed to the precise items listed? Ma'am, I think the answer to that lies, it must be yes, insofar as that's necessary to satisfy paragraph 177 of the NPPF. That needs to be borne in mind at all times. Equally important, says paragraph 177, to ensure there's a reasonable prospect that planned infrastructure is deliverable in a timely fashion. To facilitate this, it's important that local planning authorities understand district-wide development costs at the time local plans are drawn up. Infrastructure and development policy should be planned at the same time. That must be the governing national guidance in answer to that question. What the parish council doesn't understand, and I'll only give one example of this in the interest of saving time, there seems to be a fairly scattergun approach to which developments are to contribute towards which pieces of infrastructure. And I've got several examples, but I'll just give the one at the moment to give an example. So if we take the developments at North Weald, they're expected to fund £3.5 million towards highway infrastructure in North Weald, that's the Talbot roundabout, but also £3.5 million towards highway improvements in Epping, and that's about 50% of the cost of the works in Epping. And there must be the question, how does that meet paragraph 204 of the NPPF and the requirement that planning obligations must be directly related to the development? And that's particularly the case, of course, when modal shift seems to be the main answer for North Weald in any event. Latham Priory development isn't being asked to contribute towards any of the Epping works costs, although it's equidistant to Epping. And there are other examples, but we don't understand the way that the cost of the infrastructure has been divided between the various developments. It's not clear to us. Your second question is, if not, is the role of the IDP and the need for flexibility appropriately conveyed in the plan? we think that the role of the IDP in terms of a live or iterative document is very clearly portrayed in the various plan documents. But what we say is not clear is what documents constitute the IDP, how often they'll be reviewed, and when and how they will be consulted on. We've so far identified 8 documents. Well, the Council has identified 8 documents which are said to comprise the IDP. And from a resident's perspective, inevitably, there is a level of frustration as the average plan reader is going to find it difficult to be entirely clear what infrastructure needs are for a particular development. But again, we're told that things will continue to change. So there is a degree of frustration. Perhaps I'll continue that point just by, I'll make the point by asking some questions. Is it proposed that there may be additional documents which could form part of the IDP? Are they known at this stage? Policy D1 only refers to the IDP. Presumably it means the suite of documents. Does the plan make that clear? Why don't the amendments to Policy D1 state what documents make up the IDP so that the plan is clear to the plan reader? As I say, do the documents need to be consulted on? How and when will that happen? Should the plan make it clearer that the IDP is actually a suite of evidence, not just one IDP document? I'll just give one example. There are more than this, and we can let the Council know what the other examples are. But paragraph 6.15 of the submitted version of the plan refers to the District Council's IDP. Now, of itself, that suggests that it excludes the Harlow and Gilston IDP. Is that the case? So there are inconsistent references throughout the plan to various elements of the IDP, which don't tell the plan reader whether you're only concerned with that element or whether you should be looking at the IDP as a whole. And it's the case that, well, for example, various parts of the Harlow and Gilston IDP are inconsistent with the requirements of the District Council's IDP. So we think there's a lot of confusion, is my general point, and we think there is a need to go through the whole of the plan to try and make it a lot clearer than it is at the moment as to what is being referred to in the various references to the IDP, which are given different names. And the importance of it, of course, is that it's those documents which are going to tell us what infrastructure is necessary. Okay. Turning to the amendments and updates to the IDP, is further consultation opportunity for comment required? You know our answer to that is yes. I've got a few points which I'd like to put on the table. First of all, the Harlow and Gilston IDP seems to have been created based on the 2019 MPPF, whereas the District Council IDP has not been updated to reflect the 2019 MPPF, and we ask if that's a consistent approach. Again, there is a difference in that the Harlow and Gilston IDP refers to critical, essential and desirable infrastructure, and the Harlow IDP is critical, essential and required. Now, I don't know whether there's meant to be a difference, but one would sensibly assume that the criteria to be the same across the board. It all points to, we say, the need for a thorough review of references to the IDP. Another difference between the two IDPs is that Harlow and Gilston has very specific costs and contributions detailed within the IDP itself, whereas the District Council IDP has other supplementary documents which sets out the costs. There's a question of inconsistency, which we would like looked at. We do note an important but small point that sustainable transport corridors are listed in the setting category of priority, i.e. essential. We would have thought that given that so much depends on the success of the sustainable transport corridors, they underpin the plan because of the limited ability for highway improvements, we would have thought that they should be critical. The entire success of the Harlow and Gilston Town proposals are based on sustainable transport corridors, and we think they're underrated in terms of their importance. The Harlow and Gilston Town Transport Strategy seeks to achieve a target of 60% where all journeys within the new Garden Town communities are within the new Garden Town communities, 50% of all journeys across Harlow. Well, what no attention is given to on modal shift is journeys to Epping. And there is a potential expansion of a sustainable corridor towards Epping, but that's potential. It's not anywhere as a requirement. We say that, and Thornwood's going to be affected by this as well as North Weald Bassett, sustainable transport can only mean buses towards Epping. We think the plan is extremely light on communications, travel proposals to Epping. It really ignores how they're to be dealt with. And
Sorry, Mr. Jameson, I'm not going to cut you off,
okay.
but I realise that I've got modal shifts specifically on the agenda for this afternoon.
Okay.
And that's something that I think, again, I'll raise as a sort of general overarching concern is how are the proposals for modal shift going to be achieved? So I don't want to talk about the detail of it now, but I think that the sort of general point you've made is valid.
Thank you very much. I'll leave that till this afternoon. Thank you. We're grateful for. We've received from the council the spreadsheets showing both infrastructure and education proposals, and we think that they help. What we are concerned with is the lack of clarity in terms of public transport. That's not a modal shift point. It's just given that there is going to be such a heavy reliance on sustainable modes of transport, then we say that the plan is deficient in identifying. It's very good where Harlow is concerned, but it isn't beyond that. And I'm talking of links to Epping. I think I can stop there for my one go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jameson. Thank you. Mr. Butcher.
Ma'am, thank you. Just a very short and procedural point. You recall the hearing statement that we provided in respect of the specific policy sites. My issue was with Appendix 6, which has been referred to in these discussions, and particularly so far as my land interests are concerned at North Weald Bassett, is that Appendix 6 sets out no infrastructure requirements as things stand at the moment. And I can't recall, and perhaps through you, if I can ask the question as to how the council intend to remedy that point. If you look at Appendix 6, there is no list of infrastructure requirements.
Sorry, is this connected to the fact that the master plan sites are now going to be within the plan itself? So I think in terms of the master plan sites, Appendix 6 won't actually be relevant. Is it as simple as that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the infrastructure that's relevant to the master plan areas will be listed
It's in the
policy.
relevant P policy.
So when they're talking about the essential items in the plan, it means in the policy for North Weald Bassett. Thank you. Mr Ellis.
Yeah, just one comment. Miller Homes supports the amendments to policy D1B as further amended by the council this morning, and that addresses our concern.
Thank you, Mr Ellis. Mr Keane.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just to say that from our perspective, we welcome Mr Coleman's comments on the way that the IDP is going to provide a framework for master planning discussions. I do have some sympathy with the gentleman on my left to refer to the complexity of the documents. Anything that can be done to simplify that, I think, would be welcomed by most people around the table. But our fundamental point is for the South Epping master plan area, we anticipate that the infrastructure required to support that development and the timings of its implementation are one of the major functions of the overall master planning process. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you.
I think a very, very minor point from us. We appreciate the IDP as a living document, and I think we have already made comments and observations about the plan's move away from a more dispersed form of growth to delivering critical mass on the basis it can deliver infrastructure needed to support the plan. We think the findings of the IDP are obviously critical to the soundness of the plan, and we still do have concerns about the ability of the evidence before you to give you sufficient confidence that things like affordable housing will be delivered early enough in the plan period and won't be subject to late viability reductions at the end of the plan period. We're concerned about whether the modal shift and infrastructure that's been assumed to deliver that modal shift actually can be delivered or indeed delivered early enough to have an impact given the spatial strategy that's been adopted. So our fundamental issue is that we think there's still too many question marks over the viability of some of the key sites in the plan to make this plan sound.
Can I just come to Mr Goodall so that I've done this side of the table? Thank you, Mr Goodall.
Thank you, ma'am. Just a brief point. Appreciating that we'll return to what is now Part E of the policy in full later. We would endorse the changes to Part B. They are largely in line with our hearing statement, but the issue that stems from that, I guess, is the consequential changes to Part E. So we consider that Part B demonstrates that the plan it's a statement that's required to show that the plan has been prepared in accordance with paragraph 204 of the NPPF. But in terms of what is now Part E, and it's not clear from the council's statement whether it intends all the exceptions in Part E to apply or not. In its hearing statement, it has a semicolon and to indicate that they're all required, but the mods that have come today don't suggest they all need to be demonstrated. However, there is still now at Part 4 a requirement to demonstrate that full mitigation is required to outweigh the harm. Now, that's still inconsistent with paragraph 152 and 118 of the NPPF.
Sorry, Mr Goodall. Can we leave Part E? Because I specifically was going to ask you to explain your concerns under issue 1. In fact, probably ask you to start, and then I have perhaps a couple of questions specifically on Part E.
I've started and I'll finish, and I'll come back to it.
Thank you. We'll discuss Part E. Solomon.
Thank you. We're specifically concerned with the Harlow and Gilston Town IDP and its status. It's obviously necessary to bring forward the transformational growth which is required in the Garden Town to make it work. And Appendix A to that document contains the infrastructure schedule for the IDP. I think from our point of view, we'd seek to ensure that those documents carry as much weight as possible and that there is as much consensus over their content as possible in order to ensure that the plan will be effective in delivering the growth. We don't necessarily feel at this stage that the wording of the plan is clear that the Harlow and Gilston Town IDP forms part of the IDP, generally as referred to. And we do think it needs to be clear that developers should adhere specifically to the requirements of the Harlow and Gilston Town IDP in the plan wording.
Sorry, Miss Orman, can I just ask you to pause for a second? There's a problem hearing. People can't hear you. I think, but there's some complex discussion that we've just had about speaking into the microphone on a particular side of your body. Would you mind explaining?
I'm sorry about this, but we can't open the windows at the back because there's a load of noise going on outside and the air conditioning's not on. So I'm going to show you here. If I was this person sitting here, I would need, and I'm looking at the inspector, I need to speak into the microphone that is closest to the inspector. So it may seem a bit odd to you that you're actually going to be talking into a microphone which is further away than the one you think you should be talking into. But that will mean that we'll be able to pick up your voice for the webcast. Do you follow me? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt your flow. Thank you.
Now that I'm correctly aligned, would you like me to start again? Did it get through?
No, I think certainly I picked up that you felt that the IDP needed to carry as much weight as possible. There needed to be consensus behind it, but you had concerns that the status of the Garden Town IDP was not clearly referenced in the plan.
Yes.
That's certainly as far as I got. So,
yeah, that's pretty much the size of it. I think, obviously, in a few hearing statements, there have been concerns raised by developers that perhaps some of the requirements for the delivery of this sustainable transport corridor aren't achievable. So I think, essentially we prefer for this document to go through as much consultation as possible and for it to be clear whether it will be adopted as an SPD and at what stage and what time frame. And I think that would probably provide the necessary level of reassurance in regard to the fact that it would carry the maximum weight in the process. That's all. Sorry, I'll just add, we're content with the written comments procedure in terms of how we get our comments to you. And just on a minor point in relation to the specifics of the documents for the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, I think we're just concerned that the infrastructure apportionment isn't very clearly defined, as it doesn't really take account of the pooling restrictions, and therefore it could be better defined in terms of the mechanism to overcome that, I feel. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stamp.
Thank you. In terms of your questions, does the plan or should the plan identify essential infrastructure associated with specific developments? Yes, I think it should. If it's essential in the IDP, I think it also ought to be essential in the plan. Obviously, the IDP is going to give a lot more detail than the plan is, but the essential items should be in both documents, a hook into the plan, more details, see the IDP. That makes a clear link between the two documents. Details in the IDP, its living document, will change in due course. There might be different ways of achieving something, but the things you ought to be achieving to give everyone confidence in what's going to happen in the future, I think ought to be in the plan. They ought to be identified in a timely fashion in the plan as well. Reading through the IDP documents and the plan, it occurs to me that there are some really essential items like water, etc., but other items which are essential in terms of public transport and sustainable transport. And the plan mentions about establishing sustainable transport travel behaviours. And so some of the items which will establish those behaviours need to be in a timely fashion right at the start of those developments. And it is not at all clear to me well, no, they aren't actually in the IDP, some of them. And if they were, would they be actually in a timely fashion? Because the IDP identifies some time frames for delivery of dwellings. And to give you an idea on when the time frame delivery of some of the IDP items are. But some of them aren't in there, and then if they were, would they actually coincide time-wise? I did read the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, and that gives examples of things which really ought to be in there. In terms of Latin Priory, you know I was very, very sceptical about the idea of walking and cycling down Rye Hill Road. Just, you know, even if it's closed, it's still unlit. Then you get onto the B1393, walking and cycling on that, on a half-metre footway, not even continuous on one side, you have to cross down. Cycling, people don't cycle on that. I mean, walking is such a distance. Nah. That isn't in the IDP. I'm not surprised. What I would hope to have seen in the IDP was the bus link going from the north-south public transport corridor within Harlow, extending, as some of the studies seem to suggest it would do, down to Epping Station, because we know a large proportion of people in Harlow, I gave the Church Landing example earlier in the sessions, use the tube rather than the nearby rail because of the fare differences. And so one would expect it to see reference of a sustainable transport, public transport, i.e. bus probably, rather than anything better. Link between Latin Priory and Harlow and Epping, it's not in the IDP. There's a general thing about the sustainable transport corridors, but in other cases there are references to other towns in Hertfordshire or around in the IDP. There isn't any reference to anywhere in Epping Forest and not Epping, so I'm pretty sure it isn't covered that. We don't know detail. Outside the Harlow, the last thing on the Harlow Gilston, I read the IDP. I didn't go into all the details about the viability in enough detail, so the opportunity to comment on those later will be useful. I just recognise there's a £141.5 million gap in the IDP. Reading sustainable, viability work, it would seem that there's not enough viability in those surrounding Harlow sites to substantiate a decent sill, or any sill at all, I think. It suggests that even if you increase the section 106 a bit, it will start making things viable. I might have got that wrong, but that's the impression I get from the brief read. So there don't appear, apart from Housing Investment Fund, we don't know how much might come from that, there doesn't appear to be a pot of gold in terms of sill to help out paying for some of these items which are not funded, they're not all in there, and the total cost of £141 million, there's a gap there, sorry, a gap of £141 million. Outside of Harlow area, rest of the district, I completely agree with all the contents of the North Weald Parish Council statement, which looked at North Weald and Epping, and that identified a number of problems outside Harlow as well as within. I think there are some deficits there, things missing or not included, which suggests to me that the plan is going to be very hard to realise. We'll come on to the other things in transport this afternoon. And I notice even the EB 1101C, which I think is the Epping Forest District Council commentary on all the IDPs, mentions there that the PPG states where delivery of critical infrastructure is uncertain, the plan should address the implications of this, e.g. possible contingency arrangements and alternative strategies. And those aren't there either. And I think alternative strategies we might come on to this afternoon in a different way. So I think there's a lot missing, and I don't want to say a lot about the rest of the issues we're coming on to later, but there are some big holes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sam. Stad.
Thank you. Am I presuming that this is the first bullet point in general issues, and you're going to be dealing with the other one, including the concerns raised by Savills about Ongar afterwards?
Yes,
Right.
yes, I will do, but I'm not intending to take perhaps as long over
No.
bullet point 2 as this one. But yes, I will specifically ask them to address the points of funding gaps and the Ongar issue.
If I may
next.
do my majority points in that second one.
Yeah, that's fine.
And just very briefly, I wanted to say it's good to hear that there's going to be more consultation. I agree with all the statements and what has been said this morning, but my concern is that between D1, the place ones like P4, the IDP and the Appendix 6, there seems to be a lot of not just confusion, but general let-out clauses for developers, which means that in quite a few cases, I think that some of these very worthy requirements are just not going to be met. And including, if, for example, on P4, the essential items the key items actually listed in P4 don't include even all the essential items. And I think there's a mismatch there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newton.
Thank you. Madam, you're aware we've written to you about this matter, and what I'd like to do is set out our view of the role and status of the Garden Town IDP and viability documents. A bit of an overview, really. I'll be fairly brief. There is a procedural point here. I don't want to labour that because I think you're well aware of it, but it's an important starting point for this session because we know now that the Council is seeking to invoke Para 57 of the 2019 framework in dealing with viability in this plan. And I think that's now made quite explicit in the proposed changes to Policy D1. But this plan is being examined under the transitional provisions, as you know, as set out in Para 214 of the Annex to the 2019 framework, which means, in short, that the 2019 framework does not apply here. So in this CIP, we must all apply the 2012 MPPF, and that must be the position consistently across all topic areas. Now, I think my colleague made a similar point yesterday, actually, in relation to government policy on 5-year land supply. But put simply, you can't apply the 2012 framework in some topic areas and the 2019 framework in others. So I think the key point about that, really, is that we have transitional provisions for a reason. In this case, Paragraph 57 is a radical change in the plan-making process, and it can't be introduced overnight. Now, in relation to viability, Paragraph 57 is linked to a set of provisions within the 2018 revisions to the PPG, Planning Policy, Planning Practice Guidance, and also some recent changes from this year. And I wanted to draw your attention in particular to paragraph 002 under reference 2018-0724 of the PPG, which states that the role for viability assessment is primarily at the plan-making stage. And it then goes on to say, without the need for viability assessment at the decision-making stage. Then paragraph 006 states, where up-to-date policies have set out the contributions expected from development, planning applications that comply with them should be assumed to be viable. It then makes clear that it's up to the applicant to justify the need for a viability assessment at the application stage. Now, some of that wording is actually now reflected in the proposed changes to Policy D1. But the important point is that to invoke those principles, it requires a great deal of work, detailed scrutiny and examination at the plan-making stage. I think they're quite onerous requirements and they require a very rigorous approach. The problem here is that the final Garden Town IDP and viability studies, whatever their merits, have been published very late in the plan process, as you know. Only 3 days, in fact, before statements were due for this hearing. You haven't had the chance to consider the reports and to set issues and questions in relation to them for this session, and we haven't had a chance to set out our views on them in our own statements. Now, we've also, in this EIP, already dealt with viability to a large extent in previous hearings, particularly in relation to the Garden Town sites. We are now trying to adapt this hearing to deal with matters it wasn't intended to cover, and I think that's very clear from the matters, issues and questions that you set. And as I say, it's post-consideration of viability in previous sessions. the essential concern is at this hearing we don't have a sufficient opportunity to address all the issues surrounding infrastructure costs, viability, assumptions and methodology. And it's not really appropriate to consider these reports here other than at a high level. Now, if despite our concerns, and those of others, you were to decide to examine these reports and to invoke new government policy in the 2019 framework, we would suggest another hearing be arranged specifically for that purpose, where matters, issues and questions were identified in advance. You were to invite statements on that basis, and there would be enough time in the hearing to address all of those matters, possibly at least a full day hearing. Now, you could take that course of action, but I have to say that it's our position that we firmly believe in the context of the Harlow and Guildford Town strategic site that it's essential to carry out viability assessment at the application stage, and that it's necessary and justified to do so. Now, that's because we're faced here with a high level of uncertainty about infrastructure, its precise nature and its cost, particularly in relation to the Garden Town sites and, for example, the sustainable transport corridors. Now, that uncertainty can be resolved. It isn't an in-principle concern about plan-wide viability or soundness, but it requires an iterative process and engagement with developers through strategic master plans, for example, and the applications that will follow them. If you look at the Harlow and Guildford Garden Town Strategic Viability Assessment, it states actually in paragraph 220 that it will form the starting point for future development management consideration of viability across the Garden Town. So I think it's acknowledged that that report is necessarily a high-level assessment. And the publication of that report can only be seen as start of an iterative and collaborative process. I'm just going to respond briefly to your 3 bullet points. I think the consequence of what I've said is that we can't commit to the precise cost or apportionment currently proposed. We do need flexibility in plan policies while these matters are given further consideration and settled. And yes, further consultation and engagement is required. Just to conclude, I'm just interested to read the proposed changes to policy D1 under paragraph E. And the underlined section, the first part of that, I'm less concerned about. It states, where a viability assessment is submitted.
Mr. Newton, sorry, I stopped Mr. Goodall for the same reason. I want to ask some specific questions about Part E, and I have specific questions about the second part in light of what you've said. So if we can almost sort of take what you've said almost as an introduction to what I want to ask about Part E under Issue 1, I'd be grateful.
It follows on from what I'm saying, but I understand it's probably better to address that separately. So that's fine. I'll just conclude on that point for the moment.
Thank you.
Oh, just one other thing. I think there are issues about the consultation process, and I may want to come back on that in terms of the nature of that process and why we think further consultation is required.
Thank you. Ms. Riddle? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, as a general point, there is still an overall concern that the plan doesn't provide adequate and robust evidence about how the infrastructure which is needed to support development will be achieved. We recognise the challenge of specifically apportioning requirements on the list to developers and development, and that there does need to be a viability test, but there is a resulting uncertainty in the delivery of infrastructure as a result of these matters, which fundamentally affects some of the existing areas within the plan, particularly around Loughton, which is a concern of my client, into where there is a significant burden of infrastructure requirements through the plan, and the delivery of these is really key to ensuring the future of that area. We also have concerns about the sort of changing goalposts essentially during the plan period. So we had discussions about SANGs under matter 1 issue 5, and about the way that the zone of influence, I noticed that the changes to the policy suggest that the zone of influence may change during the plan period, which would change when and where SANG's delivery is required. And this is obviously would then have a knock-on effect in terms of what developers may be able to contribute in terms of other infrastructure provisions. So that remains a concern. We also note the point that's been raised about the sustainable transport strategy, which isn't available currently. And we do feel that this should form part of this process of the plan production, because it affects the delivery of development, and the delivery of the infrastructure will support that. And there's also uncertainty about that strategy when it comes forward in terms of some of the requirements, for example, bus routes, will be outside of the control of the district council. So if those form a key part of the infrastructure requirements to support development, we need greater certainty that those can be delivered through this plan. And also recognise it as a final point, just recognising that there is a difference between the situation in terms of the garden towns and the areas outside of this, but we do strongly believe that further viability work needs to be done in our case in the areas outside of the garden towns to ensure that development and the associated infrastructure can be delivered within the plan period. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Manning.
Thank you. I think I'm a rarity, and this is my first appearance here, so what I say will be heavily engineer-based rather than the basis of previous discussions here. There's been much emphasis on the discussion of developer funding for infrastructure. The scale and uncertainty of this is due to many factors: reliance on legislation, estimate of cost, availability of contributions, planning and pre-construction design, land take and availability, conflict with public utilities and national provision, cost of housing, provision of affordable housing, to name just a few, not the least being a funding gap and the programme to meet the housing provision. I've referred in my written documents to the developer funding as fairy gold, if only to emphasize the difficulty the civil engineering world is having with costs on major projects and cost overruns. And this will have an enormous effect on the delivery of the infrastructure. I was surprised to not see in the infrastructure any reference to the National Infrastructure Commission. This is a very rapidly growing body led by Sir John Armott, led by civil engineers, which has set out policies for provision of all infrastructure in a very sound way. I'd have thought the outcome of the National Infrastructure Commission and their recent assessment would be a firm objective for any infrastructure being put in on a local basis like this, as well as a national basis. As regards funding, the National Infrastructure Commission is pressing the government to provide 1.2% of GDP for funding for all infrastructure. If that could be cited with the infrastructure plan as a fallback position for funding, I think there would be confidence in what could be delivered. As it is at the moment, there must be a great uncertainty due to the developer funding as to how this can be delivered. I would like to say a little more about the infrastructure development plan and major schemes in the transportation this afternoon. Since I have only one go, I'll raise one other point. I'll
just clarify. You have one go. You'll have another go on the other issues, but only one go on each.
I'll have it on this issue and then maybe come back to it. Okay. Infrastructure is not provided for housing; it's provided for people. There's nothing in the infrastructure reports about the numbers of people. I've researched this and found that a key document is the Settlement Hierarchy Technical Paper. This is based on the 2011 survey, when the survey relates number of people and number of houses in areas in the district. It's not surprising that the numbers in many parts of this area are around two people per house. Sometimes less, very rarely more, apart from in Chigwell, where the number is slightly higher. It would be very interesting, due to the impact that people have on infrastructure, particularly on things like hospitals and schools, use of cars, parking, to have a view on how the number of people per house in these proposed units is envisaged. My guess would be it could be much higher than two, the two figure being largely because of the geriatric nature of Epping and its regions. The younger people, perhaps with 40% affordable housing, could rise as high as 4 people per house. The impact of that on infrastructure would be enormous. Not just infrastructure, but the town conurbations themselves. And I would like an observation of that in the general infrastructure report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Manning. Mr. Taylor.
I don't know if it's relevant to say all this now, but I just want to make a few points. We've attended the Harlow Local Plan very recently, which finished some weeks ago. As been mentioned here already, a number of papers have come forward since then, which people haven't been able to be consulted on, and we have concerns about that. But one of the main issues that we came across is that Harlow Council produced a list as at 31st of March, giving details of commitments that are already happening on the ground, as it were, within the district, and future known schemes. And the number of properties already identified is 1,664 properties above those required within the Harlow plan. Clearly, taking the point the gentleman's just made, this will make a big impact on the need for infrastructure within the district. That list was almost out of date before it was printed, because since then other planning applications have been made, which will take that figure to something like 2,000 more properties than is actually required within the plan. The situation, therefore, is that we think that some of the schemes within Harlow can be deleted and still be within the requirements set to the council. Clearly, these will have an infrastructure consequences for school places, for instance, the problems at the hospital which already exist. And we acknowledge that a number of the proposals in the infrastructure plan are already aspirational. And to give an example of that, on the document E34 at C9, it talks about improving and increasing capacity of library provision to serve the extra population. But since that's been written, Essex County Council are looking to close down libraries. So the fact that there's been a whole thing there put about library provision just shows how out of date and inconsistent this document is. And that's just one of the areas where residents have a concern that in 11 years' time, all the problems that we have with regard to getting hospital appointments, doctor's appointments, school places, will just be exacerbated by these plans. The gentleman touched on a little bit about occupancy rates within properties. We did a check with Harlow Council and found that, for instance, just larger houses, some 1,500 are occupied just by one person. And we feel that one of the fundamental problems of this plan is it doesn't address the issue of under-occupation and making best use of existing stock. And this can be done by building properties that will actually help people move to smaller accommodation and release the larger accommodation for families that want to come to the area. And as a result, as I say, we think that in 2031, the people in Harlow will have more problems than they have now.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry, then just to say, we're not aware that the Epping Council produced a list, an updated list, to show what the uplift is, which in Harlow, by the way, is 14%. the fourth highest in the country.
Thank you. Now, obviously, lots of points raised. I'll give the council an opportunity to come back on anything that it wants to. But one of the things I think was mentioned several times was the sort of nature of the IDP as a suite of documents and how clarity can be given to that. Again, I want to leave the discussion of the of paragraph 57 to discussing part E, but certainly I do potentially have some concerns about that, so the council can bear that in mind. But we'll come back to that. So if I let the council speak now, and then I want to cover as efficiently as possible the second bullet point on my agenda. So just so other people can be thinking about it. I've heard already, obviously, the sort of general points that there's concern about the detail and the sort of funding gaps. And I'd quite like to discuss essentially the funding gaps that have been identified, and sort of in fairly general terms about the detail that's in the plan now versus what might come later, leaving transport to this afternoon. And then if it's perhaps slightly unfortunate that I've used Ongar as the example, but again, if we can just take that as an example of how the funding gaps and things that are identified, how in practical terms they're going to be dealt with over the course of the plan period, I think that would be helpful. But I've taken the sort of general points that are raised. We don't need those to be raised all over again. Okay, go over to the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. As you say, there was a lot that was covered around the table, so I will try and address, in summary, as best as possible, the key points that you've just highlighted and anything else that I can address easily. Mr. Jameson and other participants raised the issue of confusion over the different documents and their status. I think the council recognises that, and that's a factor of the further work that's been undertaken. So in an ideal world, everything would be in the one IDP, what I refer to as the primary IDP document. But because that was published at the Regulation 19 stage before further detail had come forward from the providers in response to the final plan, if you like, as to what the more detailed requirements would be, and because of the further work that the council has subsequently undertaken to provide more clarity, we have ended up with a large number of documents, and I think we appreciate that. It's far from ideal for an applicant. It's confusing for local communities. So the intention is that the council would seek to consolidate the documents as far as possible and make it as clear as possible exactly what the IDP comprises of. It is a suite of documents. I can't confirm exactly how that will be done at the moment, but we will look to do that in due course, noting that there is still work that's going on and will continue to go on. Primarily, though, there are two elements to the IDP. There is the Garden Town IDP, which is the latest document, and then there is the suite of documents that address the needs of the rest of the district. So it's likely that there will still be two elements to it, but that needs to be clarified. And the point was also raised that the plan is inconsistent at the moment in terms of how it refers to the IDP, that it might be beneficial to make the status clear of the Garden Town work as well as the rest of the work for the district. I think we acknowledge that as well. Again, that's a symptom of the fact that further work has come forward since the plan was written, and the situation has evolved. So I think we're very happy to review the references to the IDP throughout the plan and make sure they're consistent and that they clearly identify what the IDP is, and if necessary, that they identify that the Garden Town IDP is equally as relevant as the rest of the documents, and that they should be both referred to depending on where the application is. So very happy to do that. Mr. Jameson also raised some queries around the approach to apportionment. This may well be something that you come onto this afternoon on the transport session, but I just thought it's worth pointing out that the approach that's been used is set out in the topic paper and in the addendum, and that the council has worked closely with Essex County Council as the Highways Authority to establish an appropriate approach. It's not always absolutely scientific because of the nature of the work. It's not possible to be completely scientific. There is a degree of planning judgment, but the process and methodology that's been followed, as I said, has been closely developed with Essex County Council, and is set out in the documentation as in terms of how the approach that's been used. We've also engaged and consulted with the developer forum in terms of the apportionment that's been utilised. So that took place early this year, I believe, and we had comments back from a number of parties on the approach and a number of queries which we've used to finalise the apportionment work. In terms of, there were some concerns about the compatibility of the different parts of the evidence, so the evidence for the Garden Town versus the evidence for the rest of the district. I would say it is broadly compatible and that it is all in conformity with the NPPF and the PPG. It's not absolutely identical in terms of how it approaches things like the categorisation of essential and critical infrastructure, but most of the work has been undertaken by Arup, and therefore we have consistency across the Garden Town and the rest of the district. And the approach to identifying and categorising infrastructure is set out clearly in the documents.
Mr. Coleman, sorry to interrupt you. Before I forget, because it's relevant to the point that you've just made.
Yeah.
Something else that's come up that I would like your response on is whether the IDP, whether it's intended that the plan, so through the Appendix 6 or the master plan policies, whichever is relevant, whether they should include the essential, critical or essential items of infrastructure, whether it's intended that they should do that, because we've heard that they don't in all cases.
We're very happy to review the items, but we do believe that in general, what we would consider the key, the essential infrastructure to support growth is already in the plan. And bearing in mind that the items that are listed are as a result of consultation, particularly with providers and with Essex County Council. So it may be necessary there may be some exceptions to that where things do need to be added in that are not currently in the policy. But in general, we're comfortable that what we would consider the essential infrastructure is identified in the policies.
So are you saying that where people have pointed to things that say critical or essential in the IDP are not in the plan, that's an error and that's something that you need to review? Or are you saying that there are sort of wider considerations at hand? I mean, is it necessary to cross-check that everything that says essential in the IDP is also in the plan in some way, shape or form? Or don't you think that is, in principle, that is necessary and that you have made the sort of necessary judgments about that? It's just, do you translate one to the other, or is there more involved in it?
I believe there's more involved in it. I don't think it's as simple as translating everything from the IDP that is essential or critical into the policy. The IDP explains what is meant by critical and essential, and for instance, some essential infrastructure items may change over time, which may sound counterintuitive, but the reality is that some of the elements are subject to some change. To give you an example, one of the items that was raised was concern over why the Sustainable Transport Corridor is identified in the IDP, or one of the elements of the IDP, as not being critical. The Harlow and Gilston Garden Town IDP on page 26 explains the reason for that. It's not considered critical because of the definition of critical, which is that it doesn't need to be in place at commencement of development. So it is essential, but it's not critical. And so there is a fine but important distinction between the categories. And it's not as simple as just lifting everything that's essential or critical into the plan itself. So I think we have taken an appropriate judgment as to what should be in the policy. but equally, we're very happy to review and check that we haven't made any key omissions. But I would have, as I said, I would have expected that would have come back to us through consultation and ongoing work, particularly with Essex County Council, to make sure that we've picked up everything that is considered absolutely critical within the policies themselves. Mr. Jameson also raised the issue about public transportation, and I hope I've addressed that this morning by explaining the work that we're doing on a sustainable transport strategy, which will link up and follow some of the amendments that have been made, for instance, to the North Weald and Epping policies, explaining the commitment that the Council has to providing further improvements. I think I've addressed many of the points there. The point was raised about the status of the IDP and the need for it to be considered as a supplementary planning document in the future, or at least the Garden Town element of it. I think we're very conscious of the need to ensure that the Garden Town IDP is given as much status as possible, and that's why we've undertaken the engagement we have, and that's why we brought it in front of you and in front of this examination, because we think it's important that it is given as much scrutiny and status as possible. But we don't think it necessarily needs to or could become a supplementary planning document, not least because we don't have an adopted local plan at the moment. But equally, that's why we're going to great lengths to make sure that the policies adequately set out the status of the IDP and make sure that its role as a material consideration is very clear throughout. I understand from what you said that you don't want me to address the points necessarily that Mr. Newton has raised on Part E, so I'll leave that in terms of those comments. The last couple of points I wanted to make in response were to the comments from particularly from Ms. Riddell and Mr. Manning around comfort about delivery and certainty of the requirements. I think I have largely addressed this in my earlier response, but I think the Council, in producing infrastructure plans, is reliant largely on working with other providers and with other parties to understand what the needs are, and then to seek commitment from the infrastructure providers or from Essex County Council as to the ability to deliver that and how they should be delivered, and to some extent how they should be funded. So we've worked very closely with other providers in developing the IDP and in developing the policies in the plan. So we have sought to get as much detail as possible. To some extent, though, we are reliant on the work of those other providers to develop the plans. And importantly, we can only seek contributions towards infrastructure in line with the SIL regulations, so we're limited in terms of what we can ask for. And we need to make sure that we're planning infrastructure to support future planned growth, not to address historic deficiencies. We need to follow the relevant legislation and processes in terms of what we can and can't do. And we think we've got the right balance in terms of the IDP. But the Council is and will continue to lobby for further sources of funding through the local enterprise partnership and through the government. And we work very closely with Essex County Council in terms of seeking to promote the projects and seeking to secure funding that we need.
Thank you. Now, what I'd like to do, hopefully if everyone's got the legs for it, if you like, I'd like to carry on until 11:30 and try and conclude this general, sort of the general discussion. And then we'll definitely have a break, whether we're through it or not. But I'm going to ask a slightly different question because I don't want to go over the same ground again. And I think the sort of the thing that's in my mind that I want more information about is the funding gap issue. We've heard about uncertainties. The general concerns around the table are clear, but something I want to ask more about is the confidence that I can have from a plan-making perspective that all of these things can be delivered when in lots of areas there are quite significant funding gaps, including in the garden towns where you have done detailed work to identify what contributions can come from development. Now, if we can if the council can address that and at the same time sort of address that in light of the concerns that have been raised in Ongar, so that we don't have the same discussion generally and then specifically, that would be helpful. So what I'd like to do, whoever wrote the viability study or whoever's the specialist on viability from the council, again, just from the benefit of your experience of having done viability assessments and things like this in lots of places, is it usual to have such large funding gaps identified? That's something that would be really helpful for me. And again, we've heard from sort of Mr. Stamp about the detail of things being in here. We've heard from Dr. Manning about the difficulties that developers face in funding these things. So again, don't want to hear those again. Maybe what I will ask is for Ms. Dadd to say anything that you'd like to before we begin about the specific concerns that you have in Ongar, to provide a bit of a practical context for the discussion. But then I mainly want to come to the council with anything anything completely different that's been said, mainly focusing on this funding issue, perhaps, for the remainder of this session. So shall I ask Ms. Dadd to speak first, if you're happy to do so? Thank you.
Thank you. I really want to set the scene a little bit as well, and I have looked at the infrastructure delivery programme. So first of all, if we just look at the open spaces, for example, the total residential gross hectares for the 8 sites is 17.14. The net gross is actually 16.78 hectares. If you just look at the open spaces, which is the essential ones, that totals 14 hectares. So we have initially quite a difficult problem. We've got 4 of the 8 sites have over 100 units. They're all in Greenbelt at the moment. But if you look at those particular figures, that would actually make the density for 590 homes an average of 212 per hectare for the open spaces. And the open spaces are, with the exception of a town park, which at 6.4. So if you take that off, it would still bring a density of over 100 per hectare. As an example, we had looked at R1, R2 in quite a lot of detail previously, and we know that they have been asked to, they will be required to put in new defensible greenbelt boundary, to require mitigation effects for pollution from the A414. We're not quite sure about the SUDs. Presumably ponds is more appropriate in a rural area. They'll need some sort of green corridors because that area was actually identified as meadows back in the tithe maps of 1838 and 1841. And with the new net biodiversity gains coming in, that's going to be an even more problem for them. And of course, they've also got to accommodate not having any harm to the setting of the listed buildings which are adjacent. So there is quite a few problems just looking at that particular West Ongar concept. But if you look generally at them, it would assume that within the 8 sites, most of them are not going to be able to provide the open spaces on site, so it's going to be an off-site allocation. Whether that's appropriate for little play school areas and the identified natural, semi-natural open space is questionable. But that does actually give the situation about who is actually going to deliver the goods, if it's apportioned, where are they going to be, and when is it going to be coming forward. So there's the other added thing about what about the cost of land acquisition costs. So the whole thing, because a lot of the little small ones, does give us a lot of real problems. And if you look at P4, and they have the specifically development, this is part E, and it says delivery plans, specifically development in Ongar, will be expected to contribute proportionally towards the following infrastructure terms. And it's got expansion, I think it's been changed now, expansion of primary schools. There's no mention about preschools, which is 124 places, which is essential. There's no mention about the essential secondary schools, and then it goes on to potential upgrades of existing wastewater, and yet that is counted in the IDP as critical. And then it goes on to delivery, sorry, I can't read this tiny writing here, delivery improvements of open spaces throughout the settlement, which I've just shown you the problems with that entirely. It doesn't include things like the leisure and sports facilities, and the information on the IDP is no longer up to date because some of the Love Lane is no longer town council owned, so it is a private club, and one of the desirable ones was to have more playing pitches. So at the moment we were depleted on playing pitches according to EFDC's calculations. And then another essential is of course the GP space and car parking. I know we covered that a little bit, but this car parking space is another problem. So what about the desirable effects, which we think actually community facilities and the sports pitches should be delivered? And we can see that there's not going to be any money for those to actually be provided. And what we're talking about is at the moment we're having very high density being proposed, so they're going to be little rabbit hutches with virtually no outside space, and that's setting up future social and mental problems. I mean, planning is not just a paper exercise and modelling for new development. It's about how existing residents live as well and how their lives are going to be affected. In Ongar, there are limited amenities. Transport connections to work are poor, but we do have countryside walks and accessibility. However, edge of settlement 20th century housing has shorter than average back gardens in the southeast and suburbia because of the outlook onto the greenbelt. This is now being taken away with high density, twice the existing in this rural small town. So we are concerned that the other thing is that the infrastructure must be delivered on time. How they're going to collect the money to provide these things, and when is it going to be coming forth, because all these sites are not going to be delivered at the same time. And totting up the actual funding which you are concerned about, I mean, it shows 17 million, but I know some of that is actually the education area. It goes beyond Ongar. So being a little, that's the ones that are funded. So if we're a bit on the conservative side and say 17 million, for 590 units, we're talking that equates about 25,000 per unit. And how is that going to be affordable and viable as far as delivery from developers? I think I have virtually finished, but what I would say is that there must be a solution, and we must include all the essential and desirable infrastructure. Ongar Neighbourhood Plan Community Group and Ongar Town Council are well advanced with the neighbourhood plan. We strongly recommend that the density is reduced to be more in keeping with the rural thing, and that obviously that means you'd have to look for more places, but that would also enable you to have an area of search identified on a proposals map for Ongar as a hatched area. And some of these sites that we have looked at, not in detail obviously, would able to provide some of the essential and desirable infrastructure within those areas as well.
Thank you, Ms. Ladd. So again, if I can ask you to sort of address the general, that raises some sort of general concerns that I think other people would repeat. So you've got the essential and then desirable infrastructure. How is all of this actually going to how is all of this actually going to come forward? Perhaps if I can ask the council to speak specifically about the open space, perhaps that's been suggested, but in more general terms, how are all these things within the IDP that have been flagged up going to be delivered, the essential ones particularly, but also the desirable things? What's the point in having the desirable things in there if they're not going to be delivered? And if I perhaps come back to my first question on the funding aspect of this, is it usual to have large funding gaps like this in plans? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I'm going to just do a short general about how it's going to work, the process, and give you some comfort about how the council is going to deliver the infrastructure or oversee the delivery of the infrastructure that's required. I'll pass on to my colleague Mr Evans from Arup, who will explain about the IDP and how the funding gaps have been identified, and also about how the different categories of infrastructure have been identified and what they actually mean. And then we have Mr Drummond Hay from HCH Planning, who is our viability consultant for the Garden Town, and he can explain from his perspective how the Garden Town elements are considered to be deliverable, but he hasn't undertaken the work for the rest of the district. So in terms of the way that the council will ensure delivery, the council does accept that at the moment, as things are, the local plan together with the IDP documents do not specify in detail all of the precise infrastructure requirements for each of the allocated sites in the plan. I think, however, we do consider that there is more than sufficient clarity and certainty within the local plan and the IDP in relation to the infrastructure requirements and the funding to facilitate the future delivery of infrastructure that is required to support planned growth and to deliver sustainable development. So it comes back to some extent to what I said earlier, which is this is a very comprehensive and complex plan with a large number of site allocations within it. It does make it very challenging to be prescriptive or detailed about exactly what can be provided and exactly how every item of infrastructure will be provided. In fact, it's not possible, I would say, appropriate or desirable to be completely prescriptive at the plan making stage. As I've said earlier, circumstances may change. For instance, new external funding sources may and hopefully will become available. Allocated sites in the plan may not deliver, so there's no point being reliant on a site to provide something if it then may not deliver. Or it may deliver, a site may deliver a different quantum of housing than originally anticipated. So there needs to be flexibility to respond to what comes forward at an application stage and then what subsequently receives consent. And many providers, when they respond to the council in terms of infrastructure planning, will reserve their position to confirm the precise requirements once the application comes in. And that's just the nature of plan making, unfortunately.
So again, sorry to interrupt, but that sort of brings me back perhaps to a practical point where you might be able to use Ms Dadd's concern around open space as an example. I think we all accept that not always everything goes smoothly, it can change. But if, say, in the case of the open space requirement that's been identified for Ongar, if that cannot be provided on the sites that are allocated and something external or more is needed, how are you going to ensure that happens as well as any development that comes forward? Or alternatively, how are you going to safeguard against the development coming forward without the open space that you've identified being required if the two are not in sort of intrinsically linked?
In the majority of circumstances, the council has identified specific sites to deliver key infrastructure requirements. Where a situation arises where it is unclear at the point of applications coming in as to where a particular infrastructure, let's say an open space, needs to be provided, because of the nature of the settlement, because there might be a large number of small sites, the council will need to ensure that the delivery of key infrastructure is not going to be prejudiced. So in many cases, further work may be required, particularly in terms of the example provided, open space, to specify exactly where an item of infrastructure will be provided. To some extent, that's what has already been done for education, has been done for highway mitigation works. But the council would acknowledge that we haven't done that for every single form of infrastructure. So should a situation arise where a planning application is being determined and there is still a degree of uncertainty as to whether or not the particular site will need to contribute or provide a particular item of infrastructure, that will need to be determined through the development management process in consultation with relevant stakeholders. Importantly, the council, sort of acknowledging the complexity of the infrastructure requirements in the IDP, has created a new full-time post of Strategic Infrastructure and Planning Obligations Officer, which is not something the council's had previously. And the role of that person is to manage and oversee and monitor the delivery of the infrastructure that's required. That officer will be consulted on planning applications that are submitted as required and will be responsible for ensuring that planning proposals make contributions or make the provision that they must make, and that requirements, essential or critical infrastructure requirements, are not undermined through the applications coming forward. So in short, we would prefer to have all the answers for every single piece of infrastructure. The reality is at this point that's not possible, but there are mechanisms in place to ensure that at the time of an application that there will be, that key infrastructure requirements will not be undermined or prejudiced. In the future, the lifting of the pooling restrictions will make the job of the council easier and provide greater flexibility in how contributions will be pooled. And there is also a strategy being developed by the council at the moment, which is entitled Delivering Infrastructure in the District, which will set out the processes and guidance internally that will be used to ensure the administration, monitoring and delivery of infrastructure to support the delivery of planned growth. That is due to be considered by the Cabinet on the 11th of July of this year. I will pass to Mr. Evans to explain how the IDP looks at specific funding issues and funding gaps, as well as looking at the categories of infrastructure themselves.
Thank you. If I perhaps cover categorisation first. IDPs often categorise the infrastructure that they contain into different levels of priority, and both the district-wide and the Garden Town IDPs do this categorisation. And for both IDPs, they use 3 levels of categorisation. So critical, essential, and in the district-wide IDP, desirable, and in the Garden Town IDP, required. The reason why there's a slight difference in terminology is just to make it slightly clearer. The word desirable might sound a little bit like you can take it or leave it, and it's a nice to have, whereas actually it's still an important part of placemaking and ensuring a sustainable place. So that is why, as part of the Garden Town IDP, we've renamed it required. Essentially, they are the same category. Just to explain, the first priority category, critical, tends to be infrastructure that must happen in order for development to proceed, and is usually triggered by the commencement of development activity. So it is often highways infrastructure where the highways need to be put in place first to allow those sites to come forward. The next level of category is essential, and that is those infrastructure requirements which are necessary to mitigate impacts that arise from development, and are usually triggered at the occupation of development site, either a specific phase or the whole site, and are often things like education or health places. And then the third category, which is desirable or required, is infrastructure which is required for sustainable growth and to achieve good placemaking objectives, but with the absence of which wouldn't prevent development in the short to medium term. It's worth saying that the lower priority infrastructure shouldn't be assumed to be any less important in making development acceptable in planning terms, but it's just to help guide how infrastructure might be phased and delivered through the development. If I now just move on to funding gaps, and I'll focus on the Garden Town IDP, as that is where we did a little bit more work than we did in the district level. Section 5.4 of the Garden Town IDP provides a summary of the funding gaps. So it takes the overall cost which is identified in the IDP, which is over £1.7 billion, which acknowledges the fact that it's a very large and ambitious growth area and includes the full 10,000 homes at Gilston. It takes off the funding which has already been identified and the costs which we have apportioned to development, which we think is acceptable to ask from those developments, and also some items which we don't see as necessarily part of the Garden Town funding gap. And it brings us to a remaining funding gap after development contributions of around 141 million, which was mentioned earlier. And just to put this in context, that is obviously less than 10% of the total cost which we have identified in the IDP.
Sorry, is this the garden?
This is the garden
town.
This is the garden
you're talking
town
about
rather
now?
than the district-wide. Just because we did slightly more work on looking at the funding gap for the garden town. I think we're now passing on to. Just as a last point, since the district-wide IDP was published in December 2017, a IDP topic paper was subsequently produced, and one of the things that the topic paper does it provides more details on the external funding sources which the IDP references, and explains what efforts have been undertaken to secure those funding sources and the contingency measures or the impacts or the risks that would be in place if that funding was not secured.
If I can pass to Mr. Drummond-Hay just to explain, appreciating it's for the Garden Town, but also maybe from his experience generally around the scale of funding gaps. Thank you.
Good morning. Just to start on the scale of funding gaps. We look after between a quarter and a third of local authorities across England. We spend a lot of time setting CIL, and to have CIL, it is a fundamental condition that you have a funding gap. So any authority that has CIL must by definition have a funding gap. Most of our clients, I would say, I haven't done any work on it, but I would have thought their funding gap is probably between 30 and 40%, and some of them is very much higher than that. But that's it. That has always been the case, has been a funding gap. There's always been an ongoing process of bidding for different sources of money. At the moment, it's through LEPs and HIF bids, through the Department of Transport. 10 years ago, we were doing European funding bids. These sources of funding come and go as government priorities and the amount of money in the Treasury gets bigger and smaller. At the moment, the funding tends to be linked to the delivery of housing. At different times, it's been more linked to employment space and what have you. In the viability work that we've done on the Garden Town, we've done what I hope is a straightforward and transparent viability study that's consistent in approach to the work that was done previously by Dixon Searle. And we've assumed that all of the money that Arup, or all of the infrastructure that Arup have identified, is built into the appraisals, and we haven't tried to rank anything. We've just said, here's a big pile of money that, or big pile of infrastructure that needs to be funded, and can it be funded? And we came back with the advice that the three councils can have a high degree of confidence that these developments can be delivered, but it's going to be challenging. Delivering any big scheme is really difficult. And with some consideration of the timing of delivery, the tenure mixes, the mixes of housing, and hopefully external funding, there is a high degree of confidence that the developers can deliver their schemes, because it is developers that have to deliver the schemes. It's not the local authority that actually delivers.
If I can just conclude from the council on this, I think you've heard sort of from the procedural level and from the Garden Town level. Appreciate that you're particularly interested in the Ongar situation that Ms Dad has raised, but also generally about how the council has looked at ensuring requirements come forward. Obviously, within the site selection work that the council has done, we have incorporated allowances for open space and for other requirements where they're known. So I can't talk about the specifics of the sites in Ongar, I don't have that information to hand, but as a generality, we've looked at what the requirements are and what the capacity of the sites is and how they can accommodate them. And the viability study for the district as a whole, the Dixon Cell work, has looked at the overall costs coming forward of infrastructure for sites across the district in typologies, as is required by national policy, and has looked at what the costs per unit are that can be afforded and has concluded that they are reasonable, but clearly there'll be variation from place to place.
Thank you. Just a very quick question, so if I may, to Mr Drummond-Hay. You said that it's not unusual for councils sort of embarking on SIL to have a funding gap of 30 to 40%. Presumably, though, that's before they look to developers. That's the funding gap they're trying to fill in these cases with SIL. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but presumably, in the absence of SIL here, you've been trying to fill that funding gap with developer contributions, and we've heard that there's still a 10% funding gap. So is that, I guess my main concern is that usual? Not what you start with, but at the end of the process, is that usual? However you fill it.
Yes, I can't think of a single council where the funding gap will be plugged entirely by SIL or anything else.
Thank you. Dr. Manning has got his board up. Do other people want to comment specifically? Let me just see who wants to comment specifically. If I can ask you to keep are your comments long or short? Short. Okay, let's hear them now then before the break. Thank you. Dr. Manning.
I refer to the infrastructure plan requiring a modal shift and the impact that will have on Epping Station. I see a very, very major infrastructure cost at Epping Station for multi-level bus, pedestrian, cars, looking at potentially hundreds of millions. This afternoon I also want to comment on the potential for an interchange, for a proper interchange for transport at Debden with north-facing slips to clear up the rather scruffy entrance to Debden Station with a full modal link. These surely are part of the major infrastructure change to the area. It's not tweaking the roundabouts and putting in an extra slip road. These are very, very major elements that are going to be very, very expensive. How are these going to be funded?
Mr Newton.
Thank you. Just briefly, Mr Drummond-Hay said that he referred to funding gaps in percentage terms as not being exceptional. I think it would be more revealing to look at the absolute sums involved, because obviously we're talking about a funding gap here reported at 141 million overall. And I think the question is that exceptional really, rather than looking at just in terms of percentages?
Thank you. When we get round, if you can. Thank you. Mr Stamp.
Thank you. On funding gaps, be it 10% or 40% or whatever, perhaps if the funding gap is only 10%, it's because some things have obviously been missed off the list. I'd refer to Latin Priory. All the sustainable transport things aren't on the list. And for Latin Priory to be sustainable, it's meant to have sustainable transport links. So those aren't on the list when they should be, and they have been identified in some of the Harlow ongoing studies, although they're not in the plan, which is another bone of contention. There's also some other things which aren't in the IDP, and as far as I can see, and therefore would make the funding gap bigger. They are in the IDP in terms of some of the roundabout changes which have been proposed by Essex County Council to deal with the traffic and congestion problems. But then we've heard from the Corporation of London that they can't take the land, and some of the other studies have actually recognised, no, you can't take the land to do those highway roundabout improvements. So if you can't do those and you've still got to address the problems of congestion and pollution, what else are you going to do? They might be cheaper than the highway schemes, they might not be. Some public transport things might be a lot more expensive if they're more than the bus service. So those also aren't in the IDP. So the small funding gap doesn't take account of those. And lastly, I do recognise there's this new, to me, housing infrastructure fund, which might come and save the day. But what I don't see from the IDP is any sort of idea on whether the HIF will actually cover that. If it gave some impression on roughly how much money there is available nationally to cover what sort of projects, perhaps an average which is given out, and what scale of thing that would be, I presume Harlow is going to be bigger than the average, you could identify some sort of thing to give you a feel of roughly whether there's a chance of HIF covering Harlow. Perhaps this is a commitment from government, it will do even better. But just getting a rough idea on how much HIF is meant to be covering nationally. Normally when government gives out some money, it sounds like a big figure. Then you realise how much it's actually going to cover, whether it be the police or whatever. No, it's a drop in the ocean, it's not going to do much good, it's a token gesture. It will help, but it really won't cover the problem. And there's no rough impression of that to see whether the sort of cavalry can come in and ride in and cover the shortfalls.
Thank you, Mr Stamp. Ms Belton.
Just very quickly, I was going to make the same point to Mr Newton, but it's actually a question. Was I right in thinking the 10% gap relates to the garden communities only? And if so, what is the gap for the plan area as a whole?
Thank you. Mr Jameson.
If I can start with, I think there are two problems here. The first is the size of the funding gap and whether you feel that you have got enough evidence to satisfy the NPPF that there are reasonable prospects the planned infrastructure is going to be delivered. That's going to be the test for you. On the 10% point, and I was going to refer to that, my understanding is that it's only the garden communities. And I think the gentleman from the council said, I'm saying that because that's where most work has been done. And I think that's absolutely right. If you move outside the garden communities, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, you'll find an awful lot of cases where the work simply hasn't been done. So they can't identify the funding gap at the moment. And again, that's a major worry. Let's deal with the funding gap first of all. If we take just an example, the £29 million worth of works to the M11 Junction 7, those works are listed in both IDPs as essential. And I would ask you to take essential at its face value and to ask yourself whether you're satisfied that £29 million is going to be forthcoming. We had on matter 15 a statement from the Highways Authority who said, well, if everything goes swimmingly on modal shift, we might not need all of that. But you've got to have a plan on a robust basis. You know, we're going on to modal shift this afternoon, so I don't bang that drum at the moment. But the plan needs to plan on the basis that those essential works identified in the IDP need to be funded. That's a substantial gap, and we don't know that money can be forthcoming to pass the reasonable prospects test. That's my general point on that. That's the first point. But the second point is this, that many of the items in the Epping Forest District Council IDP still have no costings attached to them. And further feasibility work is said to be required. I'd like to draw your attention and invite the Council's comment to a statement in the IDP topic paper, that's EB 1101C at paragraph 4.2, where there is a statement which says there is a realistic expectation that external funding will be secured where required, that the necessary steps have been taken to secure progress, to secure progress in this funding, but that growth will still be deliverable if funding turns out not to be forthcoming. I find that, on the face of it, alarming, because it seems to be a suggestion that, well, even if we don't get the infrastructure, we, the council, say we'll still deliver the development. And I think it needs some explanation, that statement, Mum. We have also, and this is particularly true outside the garden communities, absolute lack of costings and clarity on public transport. There's some degree of planning within the garden communities and costings, but within the Epping Forest District Council IDP, the majority of needs relating to buses, it just says unknown, and then further feasibility work required. And the parish council say it's entirely unclear how sustainable transport for North Weald Bassett, which can only come from buses, it can't come meaningfully from walking, cycling, because of the highway network, nor from trains, so it's reliant on improvement of bus services to accommodate very large increases in housing provision. But all you're told is that the requirements are unknown and further feasibility work is required. How can that satisfy the test? Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. So can you come back on any of those points? First of all, the funding gap outside of the garden towns hasn't been mentioned, and then following on from that, I guess the point that Mr. Stamp made about some things are not on the list, and Mr. Jameson's key point that some things are just not costed.
Yes, thank you, Madam. Can I just draw your attention to Planning Practice Guidance, paragraph 18. I think this might now have been superseded, but be relevant for the purposes of the plan examination. The local plan should make clear for at least the first 5 years what infrastructure is required, who is going to fund and provide it, and how it relates to the anticipated rate and phasing of development. For the later stages of the plan period, less detail may be provided, as the position regarding the provision of infrastructure is likely to be less certain. The reason I'm drawing your attention to that is because and certainly from my experience, the plan does as much as it possibly can, together with the IDP, to provide that level of certainty well beyond the 5-year period. But it's not unusual to have some questions left unanswered, particularly around funding of major infrastructure requirements. And in all likelihood, there will be external funding sources, and there will need to be external funding sources. But as we've heard, until there is sufficient clarity through an adopted local plan, and until there is more lobbying of the relevant bodies to actually obtain that funding, there can't be absolute clarity. So I won't do it now because I know we're about to break, but of that £141 million funding gap for the Garden Town that has been cited, there are very significant elements of that that are expected to come from external funding. So I think £29 million that was referred to for M11 Junction 7, we've talked about that previously. That is a scheme that is required by the end of the plan period. There is already an interim scheme that is costed and will be delivered for the early years of the plan period. The £29 million will need to come through RIS funding. It's a strategic project. It's not something that developers will be asked to provide. And until that gets certainty, we obviously put it as a funding gap. There are other similar examples, which I won't go into now. It's not true that Latin Priory will not contribute towards a sustainable transport corridor. The work of the IDP and the viability study looks at the garden communities funding, contributing significantly towards the funding of the sustainable transport corridors, and still finds that they're viable. So we are taking a worst case scenario of assuming that there will not be external funding for, as an example, the sustainable transport corridor, which is a vastly complex and expensive project. We are saying that even without the external funding, there is a very high likelihood that that could still be delivered, will still be delivered, but in all likelihood there will be external funding. So I take great comfort from that, and that can still be a policy compliance scheme even with that amount of funding coming forward. There is also a HIF bid that's just been submitted for £151 million by Hertfordshire County Council on behalf of the Garden Town communities. So we're awaiting the outcome of that process, but obviously if a £151 million bid is successful, which we hope it will be, that will more than plug the funding gap. So I would say there's a much greater level of certainty than might otherwise be the case in such a complex, large project of this nature. In terms of the rest of the district, I think we would acknowledge that the level of detail that we have is less up to date or less detailed than it might be for the Garden Town, but there is still sufficient confidence that the infrastructure can be delivered. And as I mentioned earlier, there are problems in terms of defining detailed requirements at a plan-making stage, and we are largely reliant on other providers to work with us to provide the information as to what's required and how much it will cost, but we are continuing to do that. And one of the key elements of that, as I referred to earlier, is the production of a sustainable transport strategy, which we're developing at the moment for the rest of the district, and that will provide further clarity. But just to confirm, the viability study does look at sufficient, I haven't got the figure to hand, but substantial amounts of infrastructure contributions from each site coming forward, and does find that that is viable even with 40% affordable housing requirement, which from my experience is an unusually viable situation, if you like, to be in that. So whilst there may be a lack of clarity about every single item throughout the entire plan period, there's certainly sufficient clarity to find the plan sound and to meet the PPG tests.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to stop and have a break now until 12 o'clock. When we come back, just so that you're looking at issue 1, I'm going to take the first 2 bullet points as having been dealt with already. So we'll move on to what's part C, but I think is now the part E discussion of the sort of exceptions to viability. And I'll ask Mr. Goodall to start by explaining his concerns, and take Mr. Newton's concerns as already having been set out in that context. Thank you. Come back at 12. Okay, thank you. So we'll make a start. Mr. Jameson, is your board just left up from last time?
No, ma'am, I put it up in anticipation of us moving to policy D1. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Okay, but can I go first? It's not hanging over from the last session. It's a new point. That's fine. No, you keep it there. So, firstly, I just wanted to say, obviously, I can feel it's going to be a long day. I just wanted to just to remind everybody, not that. We do need to get through the whole agenda, including transport today, because this is essentially one of the penultimate day of hearings. I think we will do, but I don't think we're going to get on to transport necessarily by 2 o'clock. Although you may surprise me. So what I intend to do probably is to go on until about 1:15, and then stop, and then come back at 2, and then we'll just carry on. We had a long day on Tuesday, and hopefully it won't be any longer than that. So just to remind everybody, if you can, I'll try as well, because I know I'm not always succinct, but if you can be as succinct as possible, that would be really helpful. So moving on to issue 1. I said I'd take the first 2 bullet points as already discussed. That's essentially just modifications, and they won't be the same necessarily as proposed. We've discussed them this morning to accurately convey the nature of the IDP, and to ensure that the policy reflects the tests in the SIL regulations. We've discussed that. So I want to move on to part C in the policy as written in the plan, about exceptions to this policy will only be considered if. Now this appears as part E now on the council's sheet, which it handed around this morning. I'll ask the council just to briefly explain the reasons for these changes, but we've heard Mr. Newton's concerns. I want to ask Mr. Goodall to explain his concerns, I think, which related specifically to part 4, but just to set out again my stall about where my initial concerns lie, and they relate to Mr. Newton's points, if you like. So, on the face of it, without hearing the discussion, the new proposed text, where a viability assessment is submitted, the assessment must be based upon and refer back to the viability evidence which informed the local plan. The applicant must demonstrate what has changed since the evidence was produced, which justifies the need for a viability assessment. In some ways, I don't have any particular problem with it up to there. I think that sounds reasonable on the face of it anyway, that you'd want to show what's changed and why it's not, you can't rely upon the information that's there. But then from there on, in terms of what the council will have regard to, I think this is perhaps is where Mr. Newton's concern is coming from. My question would be, obviously Mr. Newton's concern is that there's not enough detail and not enough certainty even around the garden town, where you have done additional work. In light of the discussion we've had about the rest of the district, my question is, have you looked in sufficient detail at the viability of individual sites, particularly outside of the garden towns, to try to bring about those tests and through that paragraph 57 of the new MPPF? And in referring to that, my reading, I've had a read recently again of the original viability assessment, and pages 24 and 25, I can call them up if I need to, but they make specific reference to the need for the council to be adaptable and prepared to negotiate, and appear, particularly page 25, to emphasise the role of the planning application stage. And so, if you're seeking to go beyond what that said, and I appreciate that your answer might be different for the garden town versus the rest of the district, but at the moment, that is the evidence underpinning the rest of the district. And so I have concerns, having read that, about that approach. So I thought it was worth me making that clear at the outset. So, Mr. Coleman, if you want to just explain and sort of have your say on the proposed changes, and then we'll deal perhaps with Mr. Goodall's point after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I'll do it as succinctly as possible. The changes are introduced to reflect the fact that in determining planning applications, the council will be determining those applications with the MPPF 2019 as a material consideration, and acknowledging that we don't want to be in a position, it's not appropriate to be in a position where the work that's done to support the local plan is not adequately acknowledged in decision making. There are two layers of evidence, and the council would recognise that the work that supports the district level work, would not be sufficient as it stands to result in a situation where you could not entertain a viability evidence being submitted at a planning application stage. And the first bullet point in the new text says, the council will have regard to how up to date the local plan and viability evidence underpinning the plan is. So I think we would acknowledge that whilst the evidence, and I've made this point several times, the evidence is sufficient to find the plan sound under the MPPF 2012, we don't think that the viability work for the district, the Dixon Cell work, is sufficient in itself to be able to apply the MPPF 2019 paragraph 57 test. And that's partly why we are acknowledging the need to do further viability assessment work, which will, in due course, then be able to be used in decision making. Once that's published, council's of the view that that would then be up-to-date viability evidence, which would assist in applying paragraph 57, but you would still need to apply these other points in the new text of little 1 in part E. In relation to the Garden Town work, we think it's appropriate to acknowledge that the work that's been produced is compliant with the PPG and the MPPF 2019, accepting, however, that it is relatively high level and is to support a plan-making exercise. So I said yesterday, and I'll say again today, I think it's appropriate that it will, well, inevitably, there will be discussions around viability at a planning application stage, given the nature of the sites in the garden communities, given their size and complexity, and given that there are elements that are changing. And that would essentially trigger the second bullet point, which is any change in site circumstances since the plan was brought into force. But what we want to achieve is to ensure that we're not starting from a position where there is a new viability exercise undertaken at an application stage unnecessarily. We want to establish the key principles from the viability work that's been undertaken, acknowledging that overall, for instance, that the affordable housing requirement is appropriate, but acknowledging that the applicant may be able to demonstrate with reference to the original work that changes have occurred which might require the council to relook at either the affordable housing requirement or the way infrastructure is delivered. So we think that the new wording still provides the appropriate opportunity for viability to be considered at application stage in appropriate circumstances. Don't know if Mr. Drummond-Hay wants to. Do you want to add anything further to that?
I did just one thing briefly. These big schemes are complex, and they've got big lists of infrastructure. And the work that we've done is high level. At some point, someone's got to write a Section 106 agreement and set out when each piece of infrastructure is going to be delivered, the amount of affordable housing, the tenures of the affordable housing. That discussion is going to be informed by a viability assessment, but that will be rather than starting afresh with the normal thing that used to happen, great big fat viability study from the appraisals. It is the starting point is the work that we've done. So it'll build on the values and build on the costs. Now the values and the costs will almost certainly be different in the appraisal because we based it on some high-level housing mixes. Different mixes will come forward. But the purpose of the updates to the PPG were to simplify the process and try and cut down on these great long viability discussions that I can think of a site in Oxfordshire that went on for over 4 years. It should be a relatively simple process.
And if I could just add, that's why we want to ensure that adequate weight is given to the work that's been undertaken, and that the councils, the Garden Town Community Councils, have gone to great lengths to ensure during the production of the evidence that the key stakeholders, particularly the promoters of the sites, have been engaged at all stages, and that we've followed the best practice guidance and the planning practice guidance to ensure effective engagement and consultation throughout. So in Homework Note 12, paragraphs 15 to 18, there's details of the work, and it sets out the approach that the councils have taken to producing the updated work. And that confirms compliance with the PPG. It also confirms the level of engagement and consultation which has been undertaken, and that includes face-to-face meetings with the promoters on numerous occasions and opportunities for the promoters to view, review and comment on emerging drafts of the documentation with sufficient time to feed back written comments. And at every stage, written comments have been incorporated into the emerging documentation. This is both for the infrastructure delivery plan for the Garden Town and for the viability study. So I won't read those out, but they're set out in the homework notes, pages 6 to 7. We've also had an ongoing process of engagement, as you would expect, with infrastructure providers as part of that. So we feel that the consultation and engagement has been more than sufficient to inform those documents.
Thank you. The whole point of this sort of paragraph 57 of the revised MPPF is something I'm going to have to give some sort of detailed consideration to. I don't think it's going to help me to talk about it in those terms for too much longer now. But can I just, in light of sort of what we've heard, it sounds like the principle that the council wants to achieve is not to throw out all of this work that it's done at the planning application stage and to start again. And in essence, that sounds to me reasonable in the same way that all the other evidence underpinning the plan people will have to refer to when they make planning applications. You shouldn't just chuck it all out and completely do your own assessment of the green belt and the countryside and all of these things all over again. I just wonder if there's what your view is about that, Mr. Newton. I'm assuming it isn't your intention to want to throw all of this out and say, regardless of what they said, we want to start all over again, and whether there's some way of achieving, if there's some balance of achieving seems to be quite sensible and reasonable principle that the council's outlined, without worrying too much about the terminology in the new plan, that sort of provides the flexibility but doesn't require you to start all over again, or risk you starting all over again.
Yeah, I think I largely agree with what you've said, because I don't really have a problem with the first part of the policy change. It's probably best to read that out just to be clear about it. It says, where a viability assessment is submitted, the assessment must be based upon and refer back to the viability evidence which informed the local plan. So I understand that the council's carried out some work here, and that's an investment in a process. It is an ongoing process, but it doesn't want that disregarded. I think the problem is with the second part, that the applicant must demonstrate what has changed since the evidence was produced, which justifies the need for a viability assessment at application stage. I don't think the council needs to go that far, and its evidence simply doesn't support placing the onus on the applicant to introduce viability considerations. There's no doubt that viability will have to be assessed at the application stage. We don't want to disregard the work that's been done. We want to continue engagement with the council constructively in relation to that work. But there isn't the justification to apply the second part of that policy modification. There was one other point I wanted to make, is that it's obviously very difficult to apply paragraph 57 in one part of a plan area but not in another.
So you are concerned, Mr. Newton, about part of the sentence that I wasn't so concerned about. So the applicant must demonstrate what has changed since the evidence was produced, which justifies the need for a viability assessment. If you don't have that, then how in practice do you not just throw out the work that they've done?
Well, the first part of the policy modification states that a viability assessment, when submitted, will have to refer back to the viability evidence which informed the plan. So it isn't being disregarded, and I think from what I've heard, that's the council's main objective, really, is to ensure that the viability work is taken into account, their viability work. I think the second part, it changes the requirement quite significantly and does invoke para 57. And all of the underlying sections which follow are really based on para 57 and also the PPG changes which accompany it.
Thank you. Mr. Jameson.
Thank you, Ma'am. A couple of comments, I hope, both constructive. My first point is in relation to D1E. It's the point that you have to satisfy all of the criteria, and I would suggest that there should be some wording at the beginning where it says exceptions to this policy will only be considered if. I think it could usefully add if all the following criteria are satisfied. I say that because at the moment there's an and between Roman 2 and Roman 3, but not between 1 and 2 and not between 3 and 4, and that's going to give all sorts of fun at planning inquiries in the future as to how it's to be interpreted. So I think that would remove the doubt if you just said if all the following criteria are satisfied. My other point is that you could have a piece of critical infrastructure identified in the IDP as critical, which you could make a case for avoiding based on satisfying these criteria. You know, there could be a junction identified that was critical. You could do your financial and viability assessment, tick that. You could demonstrate thorough investigation. You could say we'll throw a bit more money at bus services for a couple of years and see whether they take off. And the others are, and point 4, it can be demonstrated that the benefit of the development proceeding without full mitigation outweighs the harm. There's a test for the decision maker. But what I would suggest is at the end of 4, something along the lines of where these exceptions criteria are met, any proposed changes to the infrastructure requirements should reflect the categorisation of the infrastructure in the IDP, bracket critical, essential, desirable. And the reason I say that is that it shouldn't just be a free go at avoiding infrastructure. It's got somehow, somewhere to reflect the degree of priority which is attached in the plan to that piece of infrastructure. At the moment, so far as residents are concerned, it's too much of a get out of jail free card. I mean, the position of the parish council is if we haven't got the infrastructure, you shouldn't have the houses. And we need to make sure that this exceptions policy, if it's there, is as tight as it needs to be to avoid an ability for a developer not to provide critical infrastructure simply by going through these 4 tests. So 2, I hope, constructive suggestions, one relation to all the criteria and the other a cross-reference to the importance of the infrastructure in the IDP. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Mr Butcher and then Mr Goodall, please.
Mum, I'll be brief. It does seem to me that we've got an unnecessary repetition in some respects. I support what you said about the first 2 aspects of the policy, but then we have these bullet points that are set out in I, and the reality is these matters are covered in the paragraph, the suggested changes to the paragraph, and it does seem to me that the supporting paragraph sets out the guidance that will be taken into account, whereas the bullet points are effectively policy. And I do wonder whether it's necessary to set them out in that way, given that, as I say, the matters that are set out under bullet points 1 to 3 are referred to in what is paragraph 619 now. So is there a need for that repetition? That was my simple question.
Thank you. Mr Goodall, just remind me, looking at this piece of paper, which clause it is that you have a particular concern about.
I think if I may, ma'am, thank you for the opportunity. The easiest place to probably start is to say that I wouldn't agree with the concerns that as this policy is now set out with the Council's proposed modifications, it's got any risk of throwing out the evidence base. The appropriate place to cover that is under Part B with the Council's proposed modification. That ensures the evidence base for the plan is taken into account, and alongside the other provisions of national policy, including, as was, paragraphs 2 and paragraphs of the NPPF that deal with ensuring that planning obligations ensure development does not stall. You have appropriate regard to the evidence base for the plan, but an appropriate basis for preparing planning obligations. Same point as yourself, ma'am, we don't disagree with the first part of the Council's proposed addition now to where viability assessment is submitted, etc. But that is covered, as Mr Butcher just said, in the supporting text, and that's the appropriate place to, again, in the supporting text of the plan, have regard to the evidence. Where I think that leaves us, in terms of our specific concerns, ma'am, but with the modifications we've now got in front of us, I think it would be our argument that the entirety or the exceptions that are covered under Part E, they do appear onerous, and I'm not sure they're actually required in terms of the approach to planned infrastructure delivery at all. Certainly share your concerns, ma'am, with the proposed writing in of paragraph 57 of the 2019 framework. I don't think we can get away from those concerns. And that's because I think what Part E is now trying to do, because the Council's accepted the significant uncertainties in its evidence base for infrastructure, it effectively is trying to use this criterion in its policy to reopen infrastructure debates when those infrastructure uncertainties come to life or are clarified through the IDP. That certainly isn't appropriate. It's going to be necessary on the largest sites. Certainly agree with Mr Newton there that the position will be, because of the way the evidence base for the plan is, it hasn't been thoroughly tested based on policy compliant development using current costs and requirements. There are significant uncertainties behind all those things, largely because the evidence base predates the 2019 framework. You can't expect the requirements of the revised framework to have been met. So the transitional arrangements will lead to more site-by-site discussions in this case. The problem we've really got with the policy then, and the reason that we disagree in particular with what are now criteria 3 and criteria 4, is that they're essentially trying to provide the Council with flexibility in terms of how requirements might be met. it certainly isn't appropriate for what is now criteria free of the policy to say that obligations that are entered into may be required to provide for additional mitigation. I mean, clearly we know those are things that might change once the plan is adopted, but that isn't a promoter or a developer's fault. If those requirements aren't part of policy compliant development in the plan, you can't have a criteria in policy that tries to increase or introduce new requirements. And just, Ma'am, for your benefit, I think...
Sorry, my understanding, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of that was that if your viability assessment demonstrates that you can't provide a particular item of infrastructure that you're supposed to because of viability concerns, that you would enter into an obligation to say that if viability improves, you would. I don't think it's trying to introduce having to provide different infrastructure that comes along at a later date. That's my understanding of what that was trying to say.
I think that is quite... I would agree with that, and the reason I would agree with that is because the council's modified in the supporting text at paragraph 6.19 with the modifications that we've seen circulated today. Again, this does go into where review may be required. The council will expect the delivery of additional infrastructure contributions to be made if viability improves. I think that is a fairer policy requirement, but as it's set out in the policy, it could be misinterpreted, particularly given that I think there is a risk that the council's evidence base will identify additional requirements that aren't well covered by policy. And that follows on really to our concern with point 4 of the policy. It can be demonstrated that the benefits of the development proceeding without full mitigation outweighs the harm. Again, that comes back to a question of policy compliance. And it's contrary to national policy in terms of paragraph 152 and 177 of the 2012 framework, in terms of a reasonable prospect and attempting to provide mitigation, but not necessarily overcoming all harm. So we think that particularly in terms of the concerns we set out in our statement, this exception could be used for particularly small and medium sites where review wouldn't be necessary of planning obligations and shouldn't be used to try and seek particularly what the council may be suggesting in criteria 3 and 4. If there are uncertainties regarding what policy compliant development should provide in the interests of sustainable development in the plan, the correct solution to that would be identifying a more flexible strategy with the levels of development identified that are required to deliver that infrastructure. That's really our concern with this whole exception now, ma'am. I think it's appropriately covered without the exception and with the supporting text, in truth. And I may suggest, ma'am, that paragraph 027 of the updated PPG on viability does say that matters for immediate review might include the monitoring of delivery of policy requirements and infrastructure contributions against the policies of the plan. And perhaps this is an area where, given the uncertainties in the council's evidence base, many of the exceptions that the council's flags as potentially relevant under Part E are in fact more appropriately covered under monitoring and review.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Goodall. I'll take one final point from Mr. Newton, because as I said, I know that I need to consider this issue on paragraph 57. I don't think we can get a great deal further on it, but in light of what Mr. Goodall says, and if my understanding of what Part 3 is trying to do, I don't know if there's some way of rewording it so that it would sort of say obligations are entered into by the developer that provide for fuller mitigation or something. In the events that viability improves, because I don't know, my understanding wasn't trying to get you to fund new things. It was if you're not having to fund what you should have been, but then all of a sudden it's more viable than you should do. It's almost like to sort of claw it back. I don't know if you can just
that's
consider the wording of that. Mr. Newton, final points on this, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just on that point, I agree. That just needs a change in the wording, really.
Yeah.
I just wanted to refer very briefly to points that Mr. Coleman made that I agree with. And he said earlier that at present, all infrastructure requirements are not established for all allocations. He said this is a very complex plan. and it's very challenging to set out exactly how each item should be delivered. And it's not desirable to be completely prescriptive at plan making stage, so there needs to be flexibility. And in many cases, further work may be required through the development management process. I think that's a reasonable approximation of what Mr. Coleman said. I agree with all of that, and that is essentially why I object to the second part of the change in policy that I've referred to.
Thank you. Before we leave D1, sorry, I've just turned over the page and there's a whole new part added at the end. Mr. Coleman.
This ties in with the previous amendments, but it also ties in with the how-to guide for developer contributions, which is produced by the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, and is being reflected in the infrastructure strategy I referred to that's being produced by the council in terms of infrastructure delivery. So the intention is to make sure, tied in with the previous amendments, that applicants demonstrate whether or not they can provide the requirements of the plan, whether or not they can viably meet the requirements through a statement of delivery. And if they cannot, that's the opportunity then to look at viability. So it's something really for the validation checklist as well to pick up that this is something that we'll be asking for major applications to provide to demonstrate compliance, and it's about ensuring delivery of the plan and delivery of the key infrastructure requirements.
Quickly, views as to whether that's necessary.
Ma'am, I'd say it's unnecessary. This is the judgment that will be made by the local planning authority on the planning application, quite frankly. So I'll question whether any of that is really necessary. And the expectation with major developments, as David Coleman has just pointed out, we have to submit a lot of information, and part of that is a planning case, which sets out the case of the development. Our planning case would say, well, it does meet all those requirements, and then it's down to the council to judge whether that is acceptable or not. So I don't really see why it's relevant to have this additional clause, quite frankly.
Thank you, Mr. Belton.
Just practically, I was just going to add that, in lodging major applications of, 10 or more dwellings, you may not know at the point of submission what the Section 106 requests are going to be, and therefore whether the project is viable, and that's probably more relevant to your smaller major developments than your larger. So I think that could be quite difficult to comply with on the planning application level.
Thank you. Okay, it's time to move on. Issue 2, Policy D2. Essential facilities and services. So you can see here that most of my questions essentially relate, apart from something very small at the bottom there, relate to this health impact assessment requirement. So what I'd ask is that we cover that first, and then if people have anything else to say about D2, then so be it. So again, we'll follow the same approach as we have done throughout the rest of the morning. I'll ask the council my questions, and then one go each, please, if at all possible. So first of all, I just ask the council for an explanation of the purpose of HIAs, how they're undertaken, what type of information they could contain, and what are the expected benefits and outputs of completing them. If you can explain the modification proposed to Part D and how that ties in with your explanation of the first bullet. Then I'm interested in the rationale for the 50 dwelling threshold for requiring an HRA. Now, it's been pointed out that you should require it of developments expected to have a significant impact from a health perspective. And then finally, and slightly separately, I think it was suggested that an update to the supporting text to reflect the current situation with the hospital is required. I turn to the council first, please.
Thank you, Madam. As we indicated in our hearing statement for matter 14, the requirement for a health impact assessment is to ensure that developments will help to encourage healthy living and adequate levels of healthcare services are provided for the new development and community as a whole. The requirement is consistent with the local plan's vision, as amended, and relevant requirements set out under Section 8 of the NPPF, which promote healthy and safe communities. Health impact assessments should be prepared in accordance with published advice and best practice, including guidance published by the Essex Planning Officers Association. That's EB 1112. The type of information required includes profiling of the areas and the communities affected, stakeholder involvement, scale and likelihood of predicted impacts, alternative options and recommendations for actions. In terms of the expected benefits, the Council expects the health impact assessment to provide a systematic means to assess the full health impact from development and identify appropriate mitigation measures accordingly. The health impact assessment will help to reduce adverse impacts to people's health, address the needs for healthcare facilities, and maximise opportunities to encourage a healthy lifestyle. The main modifications to paragraph 6.30 and to policy D2 reflect the importance given to health impact assessments and seek to provide clarification on the role of health impact assessments. They are set out in the Council's hearing statement. They refer directly to the Essex Planning Officers Association guidance. The changes to policy D2, just for those who don't have it in front of you, the wording, additional wording is inserted to say where detrimental impact to health and well-being is identified, planning permission will be refused unless the impact can be mitigated through infrastructure provision and or funding to meet the health requirements identified. The rationale for the 50 dwelling threshold, the 50 dwelling threshold has been established in the guidance produced by the Essex Planning Officers Association. The threshold has already been incorporated into other adopted and emerging local plans across Essex, including Chelmsford, Colchester and Malden. I think the Chelmsford and Colchester are emerging plans. Page 5 of the guidance indicates that one of the first stages of the health impact assessment process involves an assessment of whether a full health impact assessment is actually required, based on a completed screening tool submitted with the application, or ideally before it is made, which comes from the developer. So in other words, health impact assessment is only likely to be required, a full health impact assessment is only likely to be required for large or complex residential or commercial schemes. Just briefly, the additional modification to paragraph 6.26 in relation to Princess Alexandra Hospital. That's a minor modification proposed to address progress that the hospital has made in its business case. And new wording is inserted to replace existing wording, which states, the work concerns the potential to relocate the Princess Alexandra Hospital from its current site within Harlow to land to the east of Harlow within the Epping Forest District administrative boundary. So it's essentially just reflecting the fact that a preferred site has now been identified by the hospital, and therefore to give more certainty about the location in the future.
Hello, thank you.
I'll just provide some further clarity on health impact assessments. Excuse me. So they're designed to be an assessment tool that looks at the potential positive and less positive impacts on the health of a whole population and the distribution of that within the population. So they're not merely designed to look at the positives or the less positives, but they're also designed to look at how we reduce health inequality within populations, many of which do arise, especially from spatial planning. There's a variety of health impact assessments, and there's a very stringent methodology that should be followed when carrying out one. So they take three forms. There's a desktop, which is quite brief and takes hours to a day-ish to complete. There's then a rapid health impact assessment which takes a couple of weeks and looks at stakeholder engagement and would also include some form of literature review. And then there's a full comprehensive health impact assessment, and the Town and Country Planning Association would only really advise this being carried out for a nationally significant infrastructure project, as these can take months to complete and are rather costly. Health impact assessments can be carried out prospectively or retrospectively, and if they're carried out retrospectively, they tend to be for evaluation or monitoring. So they're quite a useful tool for the planning authority to use when looking at health and well-being. If I may just make a few observations around the policy amendments. Healthy living, healthy lifestyles and health and well-being are terms that are that can be interpreted differently depending on your background. So my background would have a different interpretation from yours, Mum. Within plan making terms, those who advise on health and well-being are really seeking to address the impacts on health from the wider determinants, whilst addressing health inequality. The NPPF version 2019 does provide more clarity on healthy lifestyles, building upon the inclusion of healthy communities from the 2012 version. And the PPG advises that plan-making authorities may work with public health leads in health to understand and take into account current and projected health status and need of the local population. As the public health leads for the county, we have advised Epping that this should be included in the plan to make sure that they can meet the objectives of the NPPF, and our recommendation of doing this in our previous hearing has been around the inclusion of an overarching health and wellbeing policy. The inclusion of the term healthy living without any clarity on what this means or what EFDC are seeking to address in this term is problematic. Without any clarity, there is the potential for misinterpretation of what this means. This has the potential to incur greater workloads not only for the local planning authority but also for associated health partners who will be required to explain what they want from proposals, and this may delay applications as well as providing missed opportunity. Although I acknowledge that Epping have said that health and wellbeing is throughout the plan, without this overarching clarity, I think it's very difficult to carry out a robust and meaningful health impact assessment. Health impact assessments are not assessment tools for infrastructure, and I do question the appropriateness of having this within this policy. Access to appropriate health and care infrastructure is an element of health and well-being, but it's acknowledged that an array of evidence around the greatest impact on health and well-being is actually through the socio-economic aspects, and that's actually acknowledged within the NPPF 2019 and associated planning policy guidance. The NPPF also says that planning policies and decisions should aim to achieve healthy and inclusive safe places. It emphasises that planning should also promote social interaction and provide opportunities for people who may not interact, opportunities to be in contact with each other and support safe and accessible spaces, as well as supporting healthy lifestyles. The layout of the wording in the amended policy still emphasises that HIA should assess access to facilities and then goes on to say that wider issues should then be addressed. PPG also says that strategic policymakers may consult any health impact assessment and consider their use as a tool for assessing impact and risk of development proposals. The elements known as the wider determinants of health should be assessed through an HIA, and I would say that these should include the design of homes and spaces, active and sustainable travel and modal shift, opportunities around physical activity and play, the application of the Sport England active design principles, access to education, skills training and employment, the development of communities and neighbourhoods, environmental sustainability, as well as access to healthier food environments, and this is also acknowledged within the PG and the NPPF 2019. HIA are designed to ensure that all of the elements are addressed and ensure that the foundations of good placemaking include health and well-being. As you've just heard, the vast majority of these elements are not about infrastructure and will not and cannot be delivered through infrastructure because they're about design and placemaking. This brings about issues of timing. Myself and other colleagues who work in health planning advise that health impact assessments are carried out at the earliest possible stage, ideally around master planning, so to ensure that issues are addressed during design and ensure that opportunities are not missed. By having HIA as part of a validation checklist, this is likely to delay the planning process, especially when it's identified that key stakeholders in the health and care system have not been engaged in the process, and that the evidence base may have been included may be incorrect. So opportunities will be missed around really maximising the opportunities that proposals may have. Another issue that needs to be raised is around the evidence base, and that EFDC have referenced the requirement for some evidence, but there's no evidence or signposting to key strategies around health and wellbeing, including the Essex Health and Wellbeing Strategy, or the Epping Forest Health and Wellbeing Strategy, or the long-term plan from the NHS, or the previous 5-year forward view. Again, going back to my point of master planning, it then makes it very difficult for the applicant, who will be the developer, to actually understand what they need to be including within a health impact assessment or why it's being carried out. Just moving very quickly onto amended wording, the reference, as I've said, to the requirement for a full health impact assessment is inappropriate, and also references, unless they've been taken out, to the Department of Health guidance or North Essex will require clarity. The Department of Health produced a short guidance note in 2010, but it wasn't designed for use in spatial planning. And I'm unaware of what guidance is being referenced to around North Essex, because I provide advice and guidance on health impact assessments to North Essex. There are a number of health impact assessment documents that would be better placed to be referenced, including that by the London Healthy Urban Development Unit or the Wales Health Impact Support Unit. But I do very much welcome the inclusion of the Essex Healthy Places guidance note, which is due for publication in a number of weeks. Also, very briefly touching upon the garden communities agenda, most garden communities have specific health and wellbeing policies that they're aiming to address, including the Harlow-Gilston one, and other authorities working towards those in Essex. Without the lack of clarity on what Epping are trying to achieve without health and wellbeing policy, I'm unsure as to how the garden community principles that are fully embedded in health and wellbeing are going to be achieved. And this does raise concerns around inconsistency, which may be problematic going forwards. So just to briefly summarise, health impact assessments are not an assessment of access to essential or social infrastructure. Having a health impact assessment within a policy like this is slightly inappropriate, and it's unlikely to really achieve what they're trying to achieve. Some impacts on health determinants aren't obvious, and you won't see them without clarity around what we're trying to address. Public Health advise all local planning authorities in Essex where timing is allowed on healthy placemaking, and we've also supported wording around health, wellbeing policies and health impact assessment policy. It does remain the county's position that even with the amended wording, we are not assured that this plan is going to maximise its opportunities to promote health and wellbeing through placemaking, and we remain in the position that we would advise for an overarching health and wellbeing policy with the inclusion of health impact assessments and a description of what that means, with a clear objectives of what the planning authority is seeking to achieve and key partners, of who and where advice is available, and also what the health impact assessment should include.
Thank you. I know that your position is for an overarching policy, but I'm trying to cast my mind back to when we first began here, and I think I said I would give some thought to that, but at the very least said that a section was required in one of the policies. It may have been SP3, because I mean whether or not an overarching policy is required, certainly the things that you've mentioned about being clear about the requirements and what it's trying to achieve are obviously very important issues. Can I ask if anyone has any sort of fundamental concerns to raise around the whole aspect of health impact assessment? Because otherwise, if I turn to the council, it may be that the way forward here is for the two parties to speak about where best to locate this element of the requirement. As you will know more about it than me.
Yes, I think you're correct. I think you're correct. Also, have discussed this at earlier hearing sessions, and I'm also trying to remember exactly
I seem to recall it was a bit. Yeah. The reason I pointed to SP3 was because obviously we've heard quite clearly that it's a design and placemaking type issue, and that's a policy on design and placemaking. So
I think
it would seem
our position that probably previously was actually that it already is covered by many of the criteria. And I appreciate it's not as explicit in the way it's been requested, but
Yeah.
we don't want to duplicate and create confusion. So I think
And I think, again, trying to cast my mind back, perhaps we should all look back to our hearing notes from months ago now, but I seem to remember saying that I think there was merit in at least, even if not an overarching policy, in at least drawing together those strands into a part X on health, so that there was a clear section, so it wasn't just left to sort of picking bits from different policies, so you could draw those together. And it sounds from what we're hearing like HIA belongs with that perhaps rather than with infrastructure provision. So if you don't disagree with that, then maybe I could leave that with you.
Absolutely.
Along with the signposting of the documentation that's been referred to.
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Pond.
Madam, you will recall that on Tuesday we spent a considerable amount of time discussing the effects of poor air quality on lichens, veteran trees and neophytes, but we haven't spent much time on discussing its effect on humans. And can I be assured that in the redraft that has been offered, the question of air quality and the health effects of deteriorating air quality on the general population and the exacerbation of health inequalities which occur will be fully taken account of? That's point one. Point two, addressing your last bullet on the relocation of Princess Alexandra Hospital. At the moment, Princess Alexandra Hospital is reasonably accessible by non-car modes, albeit that it's in the centre of congested Harlow. May I ask that the sustainable transport agenda be specifically referred to in any modification to that paragraph on the relocation of the hospital?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think in the first instance, should explain that we suggested the modification wording, and Essex looks like, you know, they're happy with that, which is great from our point of view. We didn't seek to extend the policy, any of the policy wording beyond what it already really says and just bring it up to date. We don't see a necessity to go beyond that at this stage. I mean, obviously the hospital will take very careful account of how sustainable it can make its location and maximise opportunities for sustainable transport to the hospital in every event anyway. So we think that that would step outside what is already within the remit the policy is drafted, and just don't see the necessity for it at this stage, really. We've got one additional point to make, but it's more about the wording of policy D2, not to do with health impact assessment. Do you want...
Make it now. Yep.
Yep.
Yes, please.
So just going to policy D2B, and specifically those criteria in order to satisfy where there would be a loss of essential facility or service. In the case of the St Margaret's Hospital site, we have raised this in our original representations. As drafted, D2 would require the relocation of any PAH services which are presently on the site in Epping, even if not actually lost at all, in the sense that they would be re-provided within the catchment, to go through quite an onerous process in relation to that policy of demonstrating why they were no longer practical, desirable or viable, or to evidence that they deliver a community benefit or gain. And it could be interpreted that that isn't a neutral impact, which essentially if you were just relocating them in the catchment, that would be a neutral impact. So you provide a neutral impact, but you're still contrary to that policy. And I think we just don't feel that is what the policy's intention was to control, which was, I think probably primarily to give protection and positive assistance to the provision of essential services. And so we have suggested a minor policy amendment which would just add So BI would read, the service or facility is no longer needed, the service or facility is no longer needed or will be re-provided elsewhere within the catchment area, and we feel that that would allow sufficient flexibility and still be consistent with the intention of that policy.
Thank you. Lastly then, Mr. Cook.
Yes, thank you. The point I'd like to make really is just one of confirmation and check-in. I noted the debate that we've had so far and putting it in the context of the debate we had previously about including the County Council seeking the inclusion of a comprehensive and overarching health and wellbeing policy. In this context, of course, as you're aware, the County Council maintains that that's still the position it would like to see. I'm conscious of the fact that you've said you'd be willing to look at potential changes to the placemaking policy SP3, and we think there may be some merit in exploring that idea. What I would like to do, given the fact that we have proposed a policy on this in the future to the District Council and it has resisted that position, is to really seek clarity around the scope, the extent, the fullness of changes that the District Council might be willing to contemplate on this matter, and also the timescales for doing so. I'm just trying to avoid a situation where we get sent away to work on it and then find that the dialogue is not an open one, whereby we can actually reach some agreement and actually try to find something that we can propose to you that meets mutual requirements.
Well, I'll make my position fairly clear at the moment. I think what I want you to do for the meantime is to work on the basis. I'm not looking for a whole new policy and a whole new sort of evidence policy here. I think you can tell how I've worded my questions and the things that I'm concerned about. I think there is merit in drawing everything together so that it's clear in the plan and getting it into the right place. And I wouldn't expect anything that would extend beyond the ordinary main modifications process, which I'll outline for the council after the last hearing on the 11th of June. So I'm not looking at this stage for a long process and a new scoping and a new evidence exercise. At the moment, that's the position I have in my mind at the moment, just to be clear about that. Obviously, there's a number of matters, as I've said before, that I will, if I come to the position that I feel more is necessary, then I'll make that clear in any post-hearing advice. Thank you. Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to issue 3, unless the council would like to come back on any of the other points that were raised. Maybe you'd like to come back on the points raised about Part B in relation to the hospital.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, just very briefly. It seems sensible. We're happy to take away the proposed addition to the wording and just look at that in a bit more detail, but it in principle seems appropriate.
Thank you. Okay, issue 3 concerning policy D3 on utilities. Okay, again, this is just some clarification of my understanding here. If you could explain for me the developer's responsibilities for utilities, infrastructure, funding versus the provider's responsibilities. Now, I think from what I've read, that the statutory duty of utilities providers doesn't cover connections to the utility unless it was pre-planned. That seems to be my understanding. So if you can just explain the purpose and context of this policy, and then the second bullet point there, a specific concern that's been raised by Miller Homes. Does Part A require that sufficient capacity must be available upon the grant of planning permission? If it does, is this justified, or should it rather require sufficient capacity to meet the needs of development as it's built at the appropriate time? Thank you. Ms. Coleman.
Thank you, Madam. I mean, essentially, the policy is seeking to ensure that there is adequate capacity and connections to utilities in new development, and it is complex in terms of the legislation that governs exactly who is responsible for what. But essentially, this policy makes clear that it's the responsibility of the applicant to demonstrate through the application process there will be sufficient capacity in utilities infrastructure to serve the development prior to occupation. The purpose of Part B is to ensure that in the event that the infrastructure provider is either not duty bound to or is unable to provide the necessary access to the utilities, the council will require the developer to take the responsibility for providing the utilities infrastructure that is required for the proposed development. In terms of the concern from Miller Homes, Part A of the policy does not require that sufficient capacity must be available upon the grant of planning permission. The council will require sufficient capacity to be available prior to occupation of the development, as I've just said, and the council proposes a small amendment to policy D3. I don't think this is in our hearing statement, to provide further clarification. I'll just read the wording, if I may. So policy D3 Part A, planning permission will be granted for proposals only where, and then new wording, it can be demonstrated that, and then back to the policy, there will be, rather than is, sufficient capacity within the utilities infrastructure to meet the needs of the development. The rest of the policy remains unchanged. So essentially, to sum up, it's about making sure that there will be capacity on occupation, regardless of who's responsible for its delivery.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ellis.
Yeah, with policy D3 utilities, Part A, that's fine, which the council has just said as an update to Part A. Although I wouldn't mind seeing the actual wording, because I didn't write it down, it'd be good to see that. Part B, you have our position on that Part B seems unnecessary, because it's actually covered by Part A. It just, in essence, as I understand it, the council are talking about local improvements to the infrastructure, as against major improvements to sewage treatment works, for example, which are under the Water Act. And therefore, it just seems unnecessary, and unless people actually know about the Water Acts and other acts of Parliament, they won't fully understand that. So, you know, we stand by our position, Miller Homes stands by its position that Part B is not necessary because it's covered by Part A. But if Part A has been amended, our other comment is no longer an issue. The only other option I can see is Part B could be slightly revised, if you wish to retain that, to say where there is a local capacity problem. That's the only solution I can see. Otherwise, this could easily, people could be led to believe that a developer would be responsible for upgrading sewage treatment works, which is not the case.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else on D3 before I ask the council to address Mr. Ellis's point? Thank you. Mr. Coleman?
We're very happy to go away and have a look at that. I'll take Mr. Ellis's point. So we'll relook at Part B and propose amendments.
Yeah, if I may add, you know, we can provide alternative wording. It's just a couple of words can go into D2 if you want to keep Part B. In one way, I'm sure we can make that work.
Yeah, we'd welcome that.
Policy D4. Mr. Coleman, if I just ask you to explain the modification to Part C, please.
Certainly.
Thank you.
There was an error in the council's hearing statement. So the first part of the text should have been struck through, which I think was your your question.
Okay. Can you just read out for everybody here what it should say about the whole of Part C?
Certainly. It should read, developers will be expected to provide on-site provision where possible or where appropriate, a financial contribution towards either off-site provision or the enhancement of existing off-site facilities. This will be determined on a site-by-site basis.
And in relation to the points on my agenda, just to point out a modification is proposed to delete Part H and to include the requirement therein for marketing in Part G, simply to avoid overlap and duplication between Parts G and H. So those were the two issues that I wanted to raise. And see, Ms Dadd's got her board up, so anything now on those two specific points or anything further in relation to this policy? Ms Dadd.
Thank you. We would welcome the major modification on deleting Part H, but I think that it might need to be made clear that the area, what the area is. Now, refer to Part 5, Roman figure 5, which actually says that, and there will be no overall reduction in the level of facilities in the area in which the existing development is located, or, and then it goes on. And my reason is there are quite a lot of civil parishes that are isolated and a rural nature as part of the district, particularly in the east and around Ongar. And to comply with MPPF 73 and 74, we wondered whether it might be clearer to actually say, to be instead of the area, to actually say the area being the civil parish, because for our example, I mean, it could be quite detrimental if it was taken out of Ongar. It would be against the EFDC and Ongar Neighbourhood Plan Community Group's vision of being self-sufficient as possible, to enable viable town centre, hub and vibrant community. Ongar has very little local employment, and therefore schools and recreation facilities must be in the civil parish for you to have a cohesive community. That's, I think, my major point. Thank you.
Mr Coleman, any comments on that?
Just very briefly, Madam, we don't think it would be appropriate to make the change suggested, not least because you could be on the border of one parish. It could be more, a service or facility could be more relevant for an adjacent parish, and there's different ways to define geographical areas, so we think the wording as it's set out is appropriate.
Sorry, can I just say, is there any addition to the wording that could give comfort to places like Ongar, please?
Possibly, we're happy to go and look at the wording and see if we can provide that.
Thank you. Any other comments on D4? Thank you. Can I just take a quick show of hands as to who's interested, because I'm considering whether to stop or whether to push on and then just start the transport section late, which would possibly be a more comfortable way of doing it. So I just want to get a sense for how long we're likely to go on with D5 to D7. Now, I don't have any questions on D5, and I didn't identify any particular concern about D5 from my reading of the statements. Does anyone want to talk about D5? I shouldn't say good, but that's probably how I feel at this point. Okay, thank you. Nothing on D5. Now, I do have questions on D6 6. Let's carry on until 1:30, and then we will definitely stop, and I will allow more than until 2 o'clock for lunch. But let's carry on. I can see we might get through. So policy D6, neighbourhood planning. Now, I've asked here, is it necessary to include this policy in the plan? Someone has suggested that it isn't necessary. Who was that? Are they here? They're not here. Okay. Well, you could take that view. Let's hear from the council, and then see if anyone else wants to comment.
We think it is.
I have no problem with it being in the plan. I'll say that now.
We think it is necessary, and we think the inclusion of the policy reflects the council's support for neighbourhood planning, and sets out at a high level how future neighbourhood plans should come forward and how they should complement the local plan.
Any dissent from that position, first of all, before I take more general comments? Ms Dadd.
Well, just to say, as a neighbourhood plan group representative here, yes, we very much welcome EFDC's stance.
Thank you. Do you have any other comments on the policy? Did you want to make any other points about it?
Not particularly, because it is entrenched in law and things as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Manning.
Thank you. Again, may I speak as an engineer? There is genuine concern that Epping could be covered by a sprawling metropolis of red boxes. We've already heard of red boxes in Ongar. I don't think there's much in the neighbourhood planning part which stimulates architectural debate and vision. The government has a policy of major infrastructure and housing prefabrication, off-site construction, big units, big transportation, to avoid the brick-type context of building. I don't see anything in the sites that we have which would allow that scale of industrialisation to occur other than the Gilderston, Harlow and Gilderston proposals. And it concerns me that the nature of the housing blocks will introduce red brick rather than architectural prefabrication. I've looked at other plans, particularly the Cambridge plans, where there are within the planning documents clear pictures of the architectural concepts and what is expected with open spaces and the types of structures. I submit that because the government policy requires major prefabrication, then larger sites would be preferably looked at. And I think there are a lot of other local sites in the sub-regional context rather than the regional context, which could be developed. I'm thinking particularly about the Lower Thames crossing and the A25 extension where the road is to be cut, the M25 is to be put in cut, adjacent sites will not be impinged by motorway traffic, and the opportunities for developing that sort of site on a major industrial scale become much more apparent than those we have at the moment. And I think an infrastructure plan should follow some government policy in the direction of encouraging major prefabrication.
Can I just say, as in the neighbourhood plans, and we're not alone in this, there is a design and character for sub-parts of the area, and we will be looking at making sure that it is actually indicative of the area rather than generic, as has happened in the past.
Final comments from the council.
No, just really to support what Mrs. Dadd has said, and also obviously the council does encourage high quality design through not through this policy, but I appreciate, but through other policies in the plan, not least the place shaping and design policies.
If we move on now to policy D7, monitoring and enforcement. So I've raised 2 points here, and I think somewhere there's a policy D8 floating around. I've done with it. Okay. So I probably should have put my second sub-bullet point first. So my 2 questions here, people have raised issues about this, are: do the indicators provided in Appendix 3 provide a robust framework for monitoring the effectiveness of the plan? And then connected to that, are there circumstances which would necessitate the inclusion of a specific review policy within the plan? And people have suggested that the housing needs, allocations and greenbelt boundaries are suggested as circumstances which could lead to the need for a review of the plan. In response to that, which I haven't had a great deal of time to look at, is that obviously in principle the council is suggesting that it should include a review policy within the plan. Would it be best, first of all, to take any comments that people might have on the indicators that are currently provided within the plan itself? Do people have anything to say about the monitoring framework that's provided in Appendix 3? Mr. Goodall.
Just in the interest of expediency, I think we have provided a written statement on this, and most of our concerns, and they're well-rehearsed concerns in other plans that have similar issues with monitoring, there is a clear lack of indicators, triggers or reasons for the indicators identified and what the consequences are. The council has attempted to write some of those into its draft policy D8 that I'm sure we'll move on to. But point I'd like to make beyond our statement is just simply kind of the law of unintended consequences, I think, of picking and choosing. Not wanting to use that term again, but parts of the NPPF. So in terms of key priorities for this plan, like housing delivery, and we've had the statement from the council that they're seeking to confirm their land supply, there'll clearly be a need for consequential changes, notwithstanding our overall effectiveness or concerns over the effectiveness of the framework. So, for example, the council, if the plan was adopted as drafted and has put in its draft policy D8, it states that whether the council has delivered 75% of the annualised requirement of projected completions for 3 consecutive years, that now seems somewhat out of step with 2 things. First of all, the housing delivery test somewhat trumps that as an effective or necessary indicator anyway. But second of all, if the council's looking to confirm a 5-year land supply as part of this examination, it needs to have regard to PPG 3037 that says it must monitor performance against an 85% target and provide for a 10% buffer. There are some quite significant implications, therefore, in terms of making sure this plan is effective and making sure that the arrangements that are in Appendix 3 are consistent with everything that's been said or everything the council wants its adopted plan to reflect. I say beyond that, our headline concerns are set out in our written statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Goodall. Anything else before I come to the council? I'll just ask the council to explain the rationale for its review policy. Was there anything more on the indicators within the plan at the moment? No. Can I ask Mr. Coleman to explain the rationale behind including this policy full stop and then the sort of particular triggers, if you like, that you've put within it? Thank you.
Certainly. So in light of the requirements for plan review in the MPPF 2019, paragraph 33, Council considers it would be prudent and appropriate to include this new suggested policy in order to establish a clear, consistent and agreed basis for future local plan review. So the approach set out includes arrangements for local plan review and outlines the range of considerations that the Council would take into account in determining whether or not individual policies would require updating. The policy also sets out specific instances which would trigger an earlier review of relevant policies within the plan. So we feel it's entirely helpful for everyone that there is some clarity about how the Council will approach a local plan review. And by providing some specific considerations in Part B, and then, more importantly, some specific triggers in Part C, that's intended to give you and participants comfort that the Council will act on any under-delivery or on any major failings with the plan and undertake a review earlier than the 5-year period. So to take you through the policy itself, Part A states that the Council will complete a review of the plan and publish its conclusions at least every 5 years. That's the requirement in the new MPPF. And conclusions from the first review will be published no later than 5 years from the adoption date of the plan. That's a clear commitment from the Council. And then Part B, the Council will have regard to a number of factors. This is not an exhaustive list. There are other factors that the Council will consider when undertaking a review. And then Part C is the triggers that the Council is proposing that would require the Council to promptly commence a review earlier than the 5-year period. So the first trigger is where the Authority Monitoring Report demonstrates that annual housing delivery is less than 75% of the annualised requirement over the projected completion rate for 3 consecutive years. That trigger is one that's been used in a number of different local plans effectively and would be tied to the, if endorsed by yourself, to the stepped trajectory that's been proposed by the Council. Intentionally, the trigger is linked to 3 consecutive years, linked either to the annualised requirement or to the projected completion rate, and that recognises the fact that there will be a variation in the projected completion rate with any 5-year period within the step trajectory, so it's not setting the plan up to fail. The lack of ability to demonstrate a 5-year land supply is a clear trigger because the housing policies would be out of date. And finally, that monitoring indicates that the Council, as competent authority, can no longer conclude that the delivery of planned development will not cause adverse impacts on Epping Forest SAC. And obviously that relates very much to Tuesday's session and providing comfort as to the measures that the Council will take if things do not go as planned.
Thank you. Take comments around the table now on the, it might be difficult to be very specific about the requirements you think should be in here, but in principle, the inclusion of a review policy and the types of things and the circumstances which would trigger one would be helpful to me. Mr. Belton.
Just 2 comments. And this kind of draws back to a conversation we had at the start of the examination, really, about safeguarded land in the Greenbelt. If it transpires that sufficient housing isn't being delivered, then I wonder how efficient it will be to significantly boost the early delivery of housing if we have to go through a local plan review if we haven't got safeguarded land in place. So I think our position would remain that safeguarded land should be identified as part of this local plan process. And that land could then be called upon if housing delivery did fall below the targets that are put before you. In terms of the triggers, the only other suggestion I had was in relation to affordable housing. Actually, it follows what we discussed yesterday. We know that there's a requirement for just over 3,000 affordable homes to be delivered over the planned period. it seems to me that a helpful trigger might be, rather than just monitoring the number of homes delivered, is actually monitor it against that target and have some form of trigger that if the delivery of affordable homes is not keeping pace, then that would also trigger a review of the local plan and maybe the release of safeguarded land if that's included.
Thank you. Anybody else? No. Thank you. Anything final from you, Mr. Coleman?
No, I think we've already dealt with the issue about, in terms of the council's approach to safeguarded land and the difficulties in doing that. In terms of affordable housing trigger, I think that would also be very difficult to implement because the stepped trajectory that the council has set out is obviously based on delivery of the number of homes. You couldn't guarantee how many of those homes will be affordable in any one year. It's too precise, and it could potentially set the council up to fail. I'm not sure how that could be an effective trigger, although appreciating it's not without, it's not saying it's not an important issue, but it's just not something I think that will be an effective trigger.
Thank you. We'll end there. Thank you for bearing with me. I think it was useful to get through this morning's session. Will people be content to come back at 2:15? It allows 45 minutes. Is that okay? 2:15. Thank you.